Chapter 1: A Mountain of Rust. The salt spray tasted of metal. It whipped over the gunwale of the small fiberglass dinghy, a cold, insistent mist that beaded on Kellen Vance's jacket. He wiped a hand across his face, his eyes fixed forward. The object of his obsession blotted out the gray horizon, a monument to decay rising from the flat, slate-colored water. "She's a stubborn beast, the Mercy," Cole Martinez shouted over the sputtering complaint of the two-stroke motor. His grip was tight on the tiller, his knuckles pale against his tanned skin. "Broke her moorings in a squall 15 years ago. Coast Guard tried to tow her, snapped a steel cable thick as my arm, decided to leave her. Too much trouble." Kellen grunted, his attention consumed. He raised a pair of binoculars, the focus wheel squeaking in protest. The hospital ship resolved into a panorama of corrosion. Reddish-brown streaks wept from every porthole, from every seam in the hull plating like bloody tears on a corpse. Her official name, USNS Mercy, was barely visible, the white paint having flaked away to reveal a cancerous spread of rust underneath. A massive red cross on her flank was faded and pocked, a ghost of its former promise of sanctuary. The vessel was not anchored, it was impaled. Its bow had plowed deep into a rocky shoal, listing at an angle that defied gravity, a beached whale of steel slowly being consumed by the sea. "Is the camera steady, Maya?" Kellen asked without lowering the binoculars. In the center of the dinghy, surrounded by waterproof pelican cases, Maya Singh made a final adjustment to a gimbal-mounted camera. Her movements were precise, economical. She wore a beanie pulled low over her dark hair, her face partially obscured by the viewfinder she peered into. "The stabilizer is working, but this chop is murder on the gimbal. The drone footage will be better for the establishing shots. Clearer." "I want the approach raw," Kellen countered, a sharp edge to his voice. "I want the audience to experience this with us. The waves, the engine noise, the sheer scale of it when you get close." He lowered the binoculars, a manic gleam in his eyes. "This is the one, guys. The St. Augustine Asylum was good. The Redwater Mine was better. This is our masterpiece." Cole chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "It's a masterpiece of tetanus, I'll give you that. You sure you want a board? People around here say she's not empty. They say she makes noises on still nights, a kind of humming." "Every abandoned place has its stories. That's why we're here," Kellen said, dismissing the warning. He gestured at the ship. "A floating hospital. Imagine the history. Hundreds of beds, operating theaters, a morgue. The pain soaked into those walls." Maya looked up from her equipment. Her expression was unreadable. "Pain isn't a battery, Kellen. It doesn't get stored." "Doesn't it?" he challenged, his grin widening. "We'll find out." The motor pitched lower as Cole eased back on the throttle. The dinghy coasted, its momentum carrying it across the last 100 yards of open water. The immense scale of the ship became oppressive. It was not merely a vessel. It was a floating cliff face of rotting iron. Waves crashed against its canted hull with a deep, percussive boom that vibrated through the water and into the small boat. The air grew thick with the smell of brine, decay, and something else. A faint, antiseptic scent, like a long-forgotten chemical cabinet. "There," Cole said, pointing. "See that section of the hull, the service ladder? It's supposed to be retracted. It's been down for years. Only way up without a grappling gun. Kellen trained the binoculars on the spot. A narrow, rusted ladder descended from a dark opening about 20 feet above the waterline. It looked flimsy, insecure. Perfect. "Bring us in, slow," Kellen commanded. Maya packed her camera away securely and pulled on a pair of thick leather gloves. She unclipped a waterproof duffel bag containing their climbing harnesses and ropes. Her silence was a counterpoint to Kellen's excited energy. She was the professional, the one who ensured their daredevil antics did not become fatal ones. It was a job that became more difficult with every location. The dinghy nudged against the hull. The sound was a dull thud, followed by a hideous scraping of fiberglass on rusted steel. Cole cut the engine. The silence that rushed in was heavier, more profound than any noise. Out here, nothing existed but the whisper of the waves and the immense, brooding presence of the derelict. Its shadow fell over them, casting them in a cold, premature twilight. The empty portholes seemed to watch them, vacant eyes in a dead face. Cole secured the dinghy to one of the ladder's rungs with a thick rope. "This is as far as I go, 2 hours. You're not back, I'm gone. The tide turns fast here, and these rocks will chew this boat to pieces." "We won't need 2 hours," Kellen said, already strapping himself into a harness. "Just enough to get the money shots and document the morgue." Maya finished her own harness and performed a double check on Kellen's buckles. "Cole's right. The ship is unstable. It groans every time a wave hits it. We stick together, we move slow, and we get out before the tide changes. No arguments." Her gaze was firm, directed at Kellen. He held his hands up in mock surrender. "You're the boss, Maya. Safety first." But his eyes were already on the ladder, on the dark, inviting maw of the ship's interior. Cole handed Kellen a small crowbar. "For the doors, they'll be seized shut." Kellen clipped it to his belt. He gave Maya a nod, his excitement barely contained. He was first. He grabbed the rusted rungs of the ladder. They were slick with algae and ice-cold to the touch, even through his gloves. He tested his weight. The ladder groaned in protest, a shower of orange rust flakes dusting his hair. He began to climb, the dinghy rocking gently below. Halfway up he paused, his breath misting in the air. He glanced down at Maya, who was preparing to follow. Then his attention was drawn to a sound. It was faint, almost lost beneath the wash of the waves. A rhythmic metallic scraping from somewhere deep inside the ship. Scrape. Pause, scrape. Pause, like someone dragging a heavy object across a steel floor. "You hear that?" he called down, his voice a hoarse whisper. Maya paused, her head tilted. "Hear what?" "I just hear the hull creaking." Cole shook his head from the boat. "It's the sea. This old girl sings a lot of songs." Kellen listened again. The sound was gone. He dismissed it as his imagination amplified by the atmosphere of the place. It was the ship settling. It was the water moving things around in the flooded lower decks. It had to be. He continued his ascent, pulling himself over the threshold and into the darkness. He had breached the beast. The air inside was still cold and carried that same clean, chemical scent, stronger now, layered over a smell like old, damp paper. He unclipped a powerful flashlight from his belt, its beam cutting a sharp white cone through the oppressive blackness. It illuminated a long, narrow corridor, its walls sweating with condensation. Doors stood on either side, their paint peeling in leprous sheets. At the far end of the corridor, something was out of place. A wheelchair, not rusted but clean, sat facing the wall as if waiting for a passenger. He heard Maya's grunts of exertion as she reached the top of the ladder. He turned to help her in. "Welcome," Kellen grinned, the beam of his light dancing around the decaying passage, "to the USNS Mercy." Chapter 2: The Attending Silence. The corridor was a gullet of decay. Every surface was coated in a fine, gritty layer of dust and salt that crunched under their boots. The beam from Kellen's flashlight painted a world of monochrome misery: peeling paint, water stains blooming like dark continents on the ceiling tiles, and the skeletal remains of light fixtures dangling by their wires. The air was thick and tasted of forgotten things. "Let's get the drone up," Maya said, her voice low. She unzipped her pack and began assembling the small quadcopter, her movements swift and practiced. "I want a map of this deck before we go wandering." "Good idea," Kellen agreed, though his impatience was a palpable thing. He swept his light from door to door. Each was stenciled with faded lettering: Linen Storage 3B, Medical Supply, Quarters 300-1315. He stopped at one labeled Ward B. He put his hand on the handle. It was a heavy, circular brass knob, green with verdigris. He tried to turn it. It was frozen solid. "Give me a hand with this," he grunted. Cole's crowbar came into view and Maya looked up from her work. "We're not mapping first." "Just a peek. This is the main patient area on this deck," Kellen said, wedging the tip of the crowbar into the door jamb. "This is where the magic happens." He put his weight into it. The wood around the lock splintered with a sharp crack that echoed down the corridor. He pushed again, and the door groaned open with the sound of grinding rust. A wave of stale, cold air washed over them, carrying a scent so faint it was almost a memory. The sterile tang of rubbing alcohol mixed with something cloyingly sweet, like wilted flowers. Kellen shone his light inside. The beam sliced through a vast, dark space. It was a long ward lined with 2 rows of empty metal bed frames, their bare springs like exposed ribcage. Mattresses were either missing or reduced to stained, sagging rectangles of foam. Privacy curtains hung in tatters from their tracks, moving slightly in the draft from the open door. At the far end of the ward, a large window, clouded with grime, allowed a sliver of weak, gray light to penetrate the gloom. "Jackpot," Kellen breathed, stepping inside. Maya powered on the drone. It whirred to life with a high-pitched hum. "I'm launching. Stay here until I get a layout. Cole, keep an eye on the entrance." "Got it," Cole said, his own flashlight beam playing nervously over the corridor they'd just left. The drone lifted off Maya's gloved hand and ascended to the ceiling, its small camera swiveling. Maya watched its progress on a tablet screen strapped to her wrist. "Okay, I have a clear view of the corridor. It terminates about 50 yards down, T-junction. The ward seems to be the largest room on this level." While she worked, Kellen moved deeper into the ward, his boots scuffing on the linoleum floor. The floor was surprisingly clear of debris, unlike the corridor. He ran his light over the bed frames. On a small bedside table, a plastic water pitcher and cup sat perfectly placed, as if waiting for a nurse to fill them. They were coated in dust, yet they seemed undisturbed. He touched the pitcher. The plastic was brittle, and a crack shot up its side. From his vantage point near the door, Cole suddenly stiffened. "Hey, did you guys leave the entrance hatch open?" "Of course we did," Kellen said, not turning around. "It's our only way out." "Well, it just closed," Cole stated, his voice tight. Kellen and Maya both turned. Cole was jogging back down the corridor toward the entrance, his flashlight beam aimed at the opening they'd climbed through. It was now a solid wall of black. "What do you mean it closed?" Kellen demanded, walking quickly back to the ward entrance. "I mean it's shut. I heard it, a heavy thud like metal on metal." Cole reached the hatch and pushed against it. It didn't budge. It's sealed. Maya joined them, her expression grim. The drone hovered obediently in the ward behind her. "Let me see." She put her shoulder to the heavy steel hatch. It was immovable. "There's no handle on this side. It's a dead-bolted exterior hatch." "So what?" The wind slammed it, Kellen asked, a flicker of irritation in his tone. "Cole, the crowbar." Cole handed it over. Kellen jammed it into the thin seam. He heaved, his face reddening with effort. The crowbar bent slightly, but the hatch remained sealed. A fine line of rust trickled down from the seam. "It's not just closed. It's barred from the outside," Maya said, her voice dropping. "Someone barred it." The three of them stood in silence, the implications of her words sinking in. The only sound was the faint hum of the drone and the distant, rhythmic crash of waves. "That's impossible," Kellen said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "Cole, you saw no one." "Nothing. I was watching the whole time. The corridor was empty." A cold dread began to seep into the room. They were trapped. Their 2-hour window was irrelevant now. Their only known exit was sealed by an unseen hand. From deep within the ship below their feet, a low, resonant groan echoed through the steel structure. It was not the sound of the sea. It was a mechanical, prolonged noise, like immense gears grinding into motion after decades of disuse. The ship's humming. Maya's head snapped up, her eyes wide. She looked at her wrist-mounted tablet, which was still receiving a feed from the drone. The screen flickered. A line of static rolled across it. "I'm getting interference. Heavy magnetic interference from somewhere on this deck." On the tablet, the drone's view of the ward suddenly tilted. Maya frantically worked the controls. "It's not responding. It's losing signal." The drone, hovering in the middle of Ward B, began to drift sideways. It moved not toward them but deeper into the ward, toward the grimy window at the far end. Its light spun erratically, casting wild, dancing shadows across the rows of empty beds. "What's it doing?" Kellen asked. "It's being pulled," Maya said, her voice a strained whisper. "Something is pulling it." They watched, helpless, as the small machine drifted further and further away, like an insect caught in an invisible current. It moved past the final row of beds and stopped, hovering directly in front of the large, filth-caked window. Its camera was aimed straight at the glass. On Maya's tablet, the image stabilized for a moment. It showed a reflection in the grimy pane of glass. The drone's own light illuminated the reflection of the ward behind it, the rows of beds, the open doorway, and the three of them standing there, small and vulnerable. But there was something else in the reflection. Standing just behind their reflected figures, where there should have been only the empty corridor, was a fourth shape. It was tall and gaunt, indistinct in the dirty glass, a smudge of darkness wearing something that looked like a long coat. Before any of them could process what they were seeing, the drone's light winked out. The hum died. A sharp crack echoed from the far end of the ward, followed by the sound of something small and plastic shattering on the floor. The ward was plunged back into near-total darkness, relieved only by their two flashlight beams. The interference on Maya's tablet vanished, replaced by a black screen with two words in stark white text: "Signal lost." A new sound started, the squeak of a single, unoiled wheel coming from the corridor just outside the ward. Squeak, squeak, squeak. It was getting closer. Cole raised his flashlight, his hand trembling, and aimed it at the doorway. Kellen and Maya did the same, their three beams converging on the entrance, waiting for whatever was coming. Chapter 3: The Rules of the Matron. The squeaking stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a suffocating pressure in the ears. The three beams of their flashlights remained fixed on the ward's doorway, painting a triple-wide patch of light on the peeling paint of the corridor wall opposite. Nothing entered the light. Nothing moved. Cole was breathing heavily, his exhalations turning to plumes of mist in the cold air. What was that? Where did it go? "Shut up," Kellen hissed, his own fear manifesting as aggression. He took a hesitant step toward the doorway, craning his neck to peer down the corridor to the right, the direction the sound had come from. The passage was empty. The wheelchair he had noticed earlier was gone. "It's toying with us," Maya whispered, her gaze darting into the shadows of the ward. "Whatever closed that hatch, it's here, on this deck." "A person," Kellen said, forcing conviction into his tone. "It's a squatter, a transient, someone who thinks this is their private property." He was trying to convince himself as much as the others. A human threat was something he could understand, something he could fight. "A squatter who can jam a drone signal with a magnetic field," Maya retorted. "A transient who bars a 200-pound steel hatch from the outside without making a sound." Before Kellen could answer, a new noise began. It was soft, rhythmic, a gentle, methodical swishing. It came from inside the ward. They spun around, their lights cutting frantic arcs through the darkness. They swept over the rows of empty beds, the tattered curtains, the debris-littered floor. Then Kellen's light found the source. In the second row of beds, about halfway down the ward, something was different. One of the beds, previously bare, was now perfectly made. A thin, gray blanket, impossibly clean, was stretched taut over a mattress that hadn't been there moments before. The corners were tucked in with military precision. A flat pillow sat centered at its head. Standing beside the bed, her back to them, was a woman. She was tall and unnaturally thin, dressed in a crisp white nurse's uniform that seemed to repel the grime of the room. A starched cap was pinned to her tightly coiled gray hair. She was methodically wiping down the metal frame of the bed with a cloth that was also impossibly pristine white. Swish, swish, swish. The three intruders were frozen. This was not a squatter. This was wrong on a fundamental level. Her presence defied all logic. "Hey," Kellen finally shouted, his voice cracking. "Who are you?" The woman did not turn. She did not stop her cleaning. She simply continued her work as if they were not there, her movements serene and practiced. Swish, swish. "I'm talking to you." Kellen took a step forward, his light fixed on her. The beam seemed to pass through the edges of her form, making her outline appear fuzzy and indistinct. "Kellen, stop," Maya warned, grabbing his arm. Her face was pale. The woman finished wiping the bed frame. She folded her cloth into a perfect square and placed it in the pocket of her uniform. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, she turned. Her face was a mask of placid severity. Her skin was a pale, translucent white, her eyes dark and empty. She was not a living person. She was a memory given form. She brought one finger up to her spectral lips in a universal gesture for silence. "SHHH," she whispered. The sound was not a human whisper. It carried no air, no vibration. It was a thought planted directly in their minds, cold and sharp as an icicle. As the soundless command echoed in their heads, the air in the ward grew heavy, pressing in on them. It became difficult to breathe, as if the oxygen were being systematically removed from the room. Cole gasped, clutching his chest. "I can't breathe." The spectral nurse, whom Walter Hemlock knew as Agnes Croft, took a slow, gliding step toward them. Her feet made no sound on the linoleum. Her dark eyes were fixed on Kellen, the one who had shouted. She seemed to disapprove. "Back up." "Now," Maya choked out, pulling a struggling Kellen toward the corridor. They stumbled backward out of the ward, Cole right behind them, all of them gasping for air. The moment they crossed the threshold, the pressure vanished. They leaned against the wall, dragging in deep, ragged breaths of the dusty corridor air. "What was that?" Cole wheezed, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell was that?" "The matron," a new voice said. It was a man's voice, raspy from disuse. It came from the far end of the corridor, from the T-junction. A figure stepped out of the shadows. He was wiry and gaunt, dressed in a strange assortment of faded naval fatigues and what looked like a medical gown, stained and patched. His gray hair was long and matted, his beard a tangled mess. But it was his eyes that held them. They were pale blue, lucid and intensely intelligent, burning with a fire that was part madness, part unwavering purpose. He held a heavy, rusted pipe wrench in one hand. It was Walter Hemlock. "She doesn't like noise," Walter continued, his voice calm, conversational. "This is a place of rest. You have disturbed it." He took a slow step toward them. He moved with a quiet confidence, a predator in his own territory. Kellen found his voice, a mix of bravado and fear. "Who are you? Did you lock us in here?" "I am the caretaker," Walter said simply. "And I did what was necessary. The ship is sick. It doesn't need more visitors, it needs quiet." "We're not here to cause trouble," Maya said, raising her hands in a placating gesture. "Our drone crashed. We just want to get our equipment and leave. Can you open the hatch for us?" Walter stopped about 30 feet away. He considered her words, his head tilted. "Leave? No, you can't leave. You are here now. You have been admitted." He gestured with the wrench back toward Ward B, where the spectral nurse now stood silently in the doorway, watching them. "Agnes has already prepared a bed for one of you." His calm delivery was more terrifying than any shout. He was not threatening them with violence. He was informing them of a fact. "This is insane," Cole muttered, taking a half-step back. Walter's eyes snapped to Cole. "The only insanity is believing you can walk into a place of consequence and not become part of it. You brought your noise, your lights, your machines. You are a contamination, an infection. And infections," he said, taking another deliberate step forward, "must be treated." Kellen's fear was rapidly being replaced by anger. This was his expedition, his masterpiece, and this filthy old man was ruining it. "We're not your patients, old man. Get out of our way or I'll move you myself." Walter actually smiled, a humorless stretching of his lips that did not reach his burning eyes. "Many have tried to give orders on this vessel. The captain, the doctors, the war. The ship took them all in the end. It will take you too. But first you will learn the rules." He raised the pipe wrench slightly. "Rule 1, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "You do not disrespect the staff." From the doorway of Ward B, Agnes Croft glided forward into the corridor, her empty eyes still fixed on Kellen. The air around her grew cold, and a fine layer of frost began to form on the steel wall beside her. The three explorers were caught between a madman and a ghost, trapped in a decaying tomb miles from shore. Chapter 4: The Scent of Memory. A standoff in a rotting corridor. To their front, a man who was clearly unhinged, gripping a heavy wrench like it was a scepter. To their back, a spectral nurse whose very presence stole the air from their lungs. Kellen, Maya, and Cole were frozen, a triangle of encroaching panic. Okay, Maya said, her voice steady despite the tremor she suppressed in her hands. "We understand. No noise. We'll be quiet. We apologize." She was speaking to Walter, but her eyes kept flicking to the silent, gliding form of Agnes Croft. Walter considered her. "Apologies are for the living, they are currency. Here they are just breath, wasted air." He took another step. "You broke the door to Ward B, a place of healing. You brought your shouting into a place of peace." "It was a mistake," Kellen said through gritted teeth. His bravado was gone, replaced by a sullen, cornered animal defensiveness. "There are no mistakes here," Walter replied, his voice soft. "Only actions and consequences." Agnes Croft had stopped a few feet behind them. The cold radiating from her was intense, a physical presence that seeped into their bones. Cole, closest to her, began to shiver violently. His teeth chattered. You're letting her get close," Cole stammered, his words directed at Walter. Walter tilted his head. "The matron goes where she is needed. She attends to the agitated." His gaze settled on Cole's shivering form. "You seem agitated." This was their chance. While Walter's attention was on Cole, Kellen lunged. He didn't charge the old man, he was smarter than that. He darted to the left, toward the T-junction from which Walter had emerged. If they could get past him, they could put distance between themselves and the ghost. "Run!" Kellen yelled. The spell of paralysis broke. Maya shoved a trembling Cole forward and the two of them scrambled after Kellen. Walter did not move to intercept them. He simply watched them go, a look of profound pity on his face. "Wrong way," he whispered to the empty air. They sprinted down the new corridor. It was darker here, narrower. Pipes lined the ceiling, weeping a slow, black ooze that dripped onto the floor in thick, viscous pools. The air changed. The clean, chemical scent was gone, replaced by a thick, cloying odor. It was a smell of rot, but not of metal or wood. It was organic. A damp, earthy smell like a freshly opened grave, mixed with something sickeningly sweet. "Where are we going?" Cole panted, his breath clouding in front of him. "Away from them," Kellen shot back. "We need to find another way out, a different stairwell, anything." The corridor ended in a heavy steel door, painted with a faded biohazard symbol. A sign next to it read, "Infirmary, restricted access." The smell was strongest here. "It's locked," Maya said, rattling the handle. Kellen didn't hesitate. He swung the bent crowbar. The metal screeched in protest as he hammered at the lock mechanism. After 3 heavy blows, the lock shattered. He shouldered the door open. The stench that rolled out was overwhelming. It was a physical assault, a wall of putrid air that made them gag. They recoiled, covering their mouths and noses. "My God, what is that?" Maya coughed, her eyes watering. Kellen, driven by desperation, pushed his way inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The room was not large. It was an old isolation ward, with 3 small, cell-like rooms sectioned off by thick, wire-reinforced glass. But the source of the smell dominated the space. Growing in the far corner, spreading up the wall and across the ceiling, was a massive, pulsating fungal mass. It was the gangrenous bloom. It was a nightmare of biology. Its surface was a mottled tapestry of purples, blacks, and sickly yellows, glistening with a foul-looking slime. It resembled exposed, diseased tissue, a cancerous organ growing outside a body. Vein-like tendrils snaked across the floor, and in the center of the main mass, a fleshy, fibrous growth pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, like a diseased heart. As it pulsed, it released a fine, shimmery powder into the air, spores that caught the light of their flashlights like malevolent dust motes. "Don't breathe it in," Maya warned, pulling the collar of her shirt over her nose. But it was too late. The air was saturated. Cole stumbled backward, his eyes wide. "I see things," he whispered, his gaze fixed on a blank wall. In the walls, faces. Kellen felt it too, a lightheadedness, a creeping disorientation. The edges of his vision began to swim. The floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet. He saw a flicker of movement in one of the glass-walled cells. A man in a bed, his skin pale and slick with sweat. The vision was gone in an instant. "It's a hallucinogen," Maya stated, her voice strained. She was fighting it, her face a mask of concentration. "We have to get out of this room, now." Cole was not listening. He was pointing at the wall, his finger trembling. "He's scared. They're going to cut it off. His leg. He doesn't want them to cut it off." His voice was filled with a desperate, second-hand terror. He was no longer in the ship in the present. He was experiencing a memory trapped in the very air of the room. From behind them in the corridor, Walter's voice drifted in, calm and didactic. This was a place for the worst cases. The gangrene, the rot that sets into the flesh, the bloom. It remembers them all. It breathes their last moments. They turned. Walter stood in the doorway, the pipe wrench held loosely at his side. He was not affected by the spores. Perhaps he was immune after so many years, or perhaps he simply didn't breathe them in. "You led us here," Kellen accused, his own thoughts becoming tangled. The dripping from the pipes in the hall now sounded like a man sobbing. "You ran here," Walter corrected gently. "The ship guides you where you need to go. You needed to understand the sickness. Now you do." Cole suddenly screamed, a raw, piercing sound of agony. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his right leg. "It hurts. They're cutting it. Make them stop." He was writhing on the floor, his face contorted in a mask of pain that was not his own. The spores were not just showing him a memory, they were making him live it. "Cole, snap out of it," Maya yelled, rushing to his side. She tried to grab his shoulders, but he thrashed wildly, his eyes seeing an operating theater that wasn't there. Walter watched the scene with a detached, clinical interest. The fear is potent, isn't it? The most potent ones feed the bloom. It helps it grow. Kellen's mind was a whirlwind of fear and spore-induced confusion. The pulsating of the fungal mass seemed to sync with his own racing heartbeat. He saw his own father, dying in a hospital bed years ago, superimposed over Cole's screaming form. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back, his flashlight beam wavering. He had to get them out. Ignoring his own swimming senses and the ghostly images flickering at the edge of his sight, Kellen grabbed Cole under the arms. "Maya, help me. We have to drag him out." Together, they hauled the screaming, thrashing man out of the infirmary and back into the relative clarity of the corridor. The moment they were clear of the room, Cole's screams subsided into ragged sobs. The phantom pain seemed to recede, leaving him trembling and pale on the floor. Kellen slammed the infirmary door shut, the biohazard symbol seeming like a grim understatement. He turned on Walter, his fear now burned away by a pure, white-hot rage. "You did this. You're trying to kill us." Walter shook his head slowly. "Kill you? No, you misunderstand completely." He took a step closer, his pale eyes locking onto Kellen's. "Death is a release, a transition. I am not a killer. I am a therapist. The ship is my instrument and you are my new patients. Your treatment," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "has just begun." He pointed the pipe wrench past them, down another, even darker corridor they had not yet noticed. "Your friend will need to rest. There is a room. It is quiet. It is safe." Kellen and Maya looked where he pointed. It was a path leading deeper into the ship's black heart. They had no choice but to trust the madman, because behind them was the specter of the matron and the memory-plagued air of the gangrenous bloom. They were being herded. Chapter 5. A Bed for the Afflicted. The corridor Walter directed them down was different. It was a service passage, narrow and lined with thick bundles of cables and pipes held to the walls by rusted brackets. There were no doors, only the unceasing metal walls and the low ceiling that forced them to stoop. The only light was from their own wavering beams. The only sound was Cole's ragged breathing and the soft, almost silent tread of Walter's worn boots behind them. He followed at a distance of 20 feet, a shepherd guiding his flock. "Where are you taking us?" Maya asked, her voice a tense whisper. She and Kellen were half dragging, half carrying Cole, whose brief episode of violent agony had left him limp and disoriented. "A recovery room," Walter's voice echoed in the tight space. "A place for him to quiet his mind. The ship can be loud if you're not accustomed to its voices." "The voices are in your head, old man," Kellen snarled, but his insult lacked force. The spores had left him shaken, the image of his dying father still seared onto the back of his eyelids. "My head, your head," Walter chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "You think there's a difference here. The ship is the head, we are just thoughts inside it." The passage opened into a small, square room. It appeared to be a former storage depot or a minor utility junction. It was empty except for a single, stark object in the center, a metal-framed bed, identical to the ones in Ward B. This one, however, had a thin, stained mattress on it. A threadbare wool blanket was folded neatly at its foot. The room was cold, silent, and felt utterly isolated from the rest of the vessel. There was only one way in or out. "Put him here," Walter instructed, gesturing to the bed with his wrench. Kellen and Maya hesitated. The setup was too perfect, too deliberate. It felt like a trap. "He needs to lie down," Walter insisted, his voice hardening slightly. "The memory shock is taxing on the heart. Let him rest." Cole moaned, his eyes fluttering open. "My leg felt like fire." Left with little choice, they gently lowered Cole onto the mattress. He curled into a fetal position, his body still trembling. Maya took off her own jacket and draped it over him. It was a small, human gesture in a place that felt increasingly devoid of humanity. "Now what?" Kellen demanded, turning to face Walter, who stood in the doorway, blocking their only exit. "Now we wait," Walter said. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, the wrench held loosely in his hand. "We let the medicine work." "What medicine? The damn fungus." "The ship is the medicine," Walter corrected patiently. "It identifies the sickness in each person and provides the appropriate treatment. Your friend, he carries a deep fear of helplessness, of being held down and hurt. The bloom offered him a chance to confront that." Maya stared at him, a dawning horror on her face. "You're analyzing us." "Of course," Walter said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "How can I facilitate your treatment if I do not understand your ailments?" "The vlogger," he said, his piercing eyes landing on Kellen, "you fear irrelevance, failure. You seek validation in dangerous places because you have none inside yourself. A profound emptiness. A classic case." Kellen felt a jolt, as if the man had read a page from a book he didn't know he had written. "You don't know anything about me." "And the woman," Walter continued, his gaze shifting to Maya. "You fear chaos, the loss of control. You surround yourself with technology, with plans, with rules. You believe you can manage the world into safety, but you cannot manage this place. Your fear is the most difficult to treat." The three of them were silent. Walter's insane diagnoses were chillingly accurate. He was not just a madman. He was observant, intelligent, and operating on a logic that was terrifyingly consistent within his own world. A low creak came from the ceiling above them. A shower of rust flakes drifted down, dusting Cole's sleeping form. "This room is not safe," Maya stated, her eyes tracing the water-stained ceiling. "No room is safe," Walter countered, "but this one is necessary for the next step." He pushed himself off the doorframe and took a step into the room. Kellen immediately tensed, shifting his weight, ready for a confrontation. "You have seen the matron. You have smelled the bloom," Walter said, his voice low and hypnotic. "You have been admitted. You have been diagnosed. Now comes the isolation phase." He moved with a speed that belied his age and gaunt frame. He wasn't lunging at Kellen or Maya. He was moving toward the wall behind the bed. His hand found something in the dark, a large, recessed lever Kellen hadn't noticed. With a grunt of effort, Walter pulled it down. A deafening clang echoed through the room as a heavy steel shutter slammed down over the doorway, plunging them into absolute, suffocating blackness. It descended so quickly they had no time to react. The sound of a heavy bolt being thrown on the other side sealed their fate. They were trapped, not just on the ship, but in this small, black room with their injured friend. "What did you do?" Kellen roared, scrambling toward the door and pounding on the cold, unyielding steel. "Let us out." There was no response from Walter. Maya fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking. She clicked it on. The beam cut a lonely, pathetic cone through the darkness. It illuminated Kellen's futile assault on the door and Cole, who was now sitting bolt upright on the bed, his eyes wide with a fresh terror. "The bed," Cole whispered, his voice trembling. "It's moving." Kellen and Maya spun around. The bed wasn't moving, but a new sound had started, a low, mechanical whirring coming from the wall behind it. Thick leather straps, stained and dark, began to emerge from slots in the wall at the head and foot of the bed. They snaked forward with a life of their own, like questing tentacles. Two wrapped around the bed frame near where Cole's ankles would be. Two more materialized near the head of the bed, reaching for his wrists. This wasn't a recovery room. It was a restraint room. Before they could react, a piercing digital screech erupted from the small pack on Maya's belt. She tore it open. It was Cole's personal camera, the one that had been clipped to his chest. She had picked it up after he collapsed. Its screen, previously dead, was now glowing with a single, pulsing image. It was the last thing the camera had recorded before it was shut off. The terrified, wide-eyed face of Cole looking up at his attacker. And reflected in his pupils, tiny but unmistakable, was the face of the man who had disabled his camera, the face of their hunter. It was the calm, mad, familiar face of Walter Hemlock. The screeching from the camera intensified, and from the speaker, a distorted voice, Cole's voice, played on a loop, a fragment of his last moments of freedom. "No, don't get away from M." The leather straps shot forward, faster now, snapping through the air like whips as they lunged for Cole. Chapter 6: The Surgeon's Hands. The leather straps moved with a horrifying, unnatural life. They were not merely retracting, they were hunting. Cole screamed, a raw animal sound, and scrambled off the bed, crab-walking backward on the floor until his back hit the cold steel of the far wall. The straps, deprived of their primary target, writhed for a moment in the air before slowly, methodically, retracting back into their slots in the wall with a series of soft, final clicks. The mechanical whirring ceased. "He controls the whole ship," Maya said, her voice a strained whisper. The beam of her flashlight was fixed on the now empty slots in the wall. The hatch, the drone, these restraints. It's all wired to him somehow. Kellen had stopped pounding on the door. He leaned against it, his breathing harsh in the confined space. The revelation had shifted his fear from a primal dread of ghosts and madmen into a more concrete, tactical terror. They were not just trapped in a haunted house. They were rats in a sophisticated, automated cage controlled by a psychopath. "The lever," Kellen said, turning his flashlight on the wall where Walter had stood. "He didn't just lock us in, he activated this room." He ran his hand along the wall, searching for a seam, a panel, anything that could be forced. The steel was smooth, seamless. Cole was still on the floor, huddled into a ball, his sobbing having subsided into a continuous, low whimper. The psychological assault was breaking him down piece by piece. First the phantom pain of the bloom, now this. He was the focal point of the ship's and Walter's attention. "We need to calm him down," Maya said, moving toward Cole. "Panic is what this place feeds on." "Calm him down," Kellen retorted, his voice sharp with frustration. "Look around, Maya. There is no calm here. We're locked in a torture chamber and he's out there, planning his next move." As if on cue, a new sound began. It was not from their room, but from outside. A faint, rhythmic scraping. It was the same sound Kellen had heard when they first boarded the ship. Scrape. Pause, scrape, pause. It was coming from the corridor, growing steadily louder. "What is that?" Maya asked, her head tilted, listening. "I heard it before," Kellen said, "when I was on the ladder." The scraping stopped directly outside their door. A heavy object thudded against the steel shutter. Then came a new sound, a metallic clicking, precise and delicate. It was the sound of tools being laid out on a metal tray. Click, clink, click. A voice slid through the steel door, clear and close. It was Walter. "The patient seems to be rejecting the initial therapy. He displays extreme paranoia and agitation. A more direct approach is required." "What are you doing out there?" Kellen yelled at the door. "Preparing for surgery," Walter's voice replied, serene and untroubled. "Sometimes the sickness is a physical thing, a pressure on the brain. It must be relieved." A high-pitched whirring sound started, like a small, powerful drill. It vibrated through the door, through the floor, a sound that bypassed the ears and burrowed straight into the skull. Cole let out a thin, terrified wail and pressed himself harder against the wall. "He's not serious," Maya whispered, but her face was ashen. "He can't be." "He is," Kellen said grimly. He started to pace the small room, a caged animal. "He's a madman playing doctor, and we're his lab rats. We have to get out of here." His flashlight beam swept across the room, searching for any weakness. The walls, the floor, the door, all solid steel. He looked up. The ceiling. It was made of interlocking metal panels, stained and corroded, but different from the solid walls. One of them in the corner looked looser than the others, its edges warped and bent downward. "There," he said, pointing, "the ceiling." Maya aimed her light up. "It's at least 12 feet high. We can't reach it." "The bed," Kellen said, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. "We can move the bed." The metal bed frame was heavy, but between the two of them, they managed to scrape it across the floor, its legs groaning in protest. They positioned it directly under the damaged panel. "I'll go," Kellen said. "I'm heavier. I can break it open if I have to." He climbed onto the creaking mattress, the old springs complaining under his weight. Standing on the frame, he could just reach the panel. The metal was cold and slick with condensation. He pushed upward. It gave a little groaning. "Use the crowbar," Maya instructed, passing it up to him. Kellen wedged the bent tip of the crowbar into the seam and pried. The panel screeched, bending. He pried again, putting his whole body into it. With a loud tearing sound, a corner of the panel ripped free from its housing. A cascade of rust, dirt, and something that looked like dried nests fell down, showering him. A dark, narrow space was revealed above. The drilling sound from outside, the door stopped. A heavy silence fell. Then Walter's voice, now laced with a tone of disappointment. "Leaving the recovery room before the procedure is complete is not advised. It can have complications." A loud hiss echoed from the corridor, followed by a clanking sound, as if a valve had been opened. A thin, grayish mist began to seep under the steel door. It was odorless, colorless, curling like smoke as it crept into the room. "Anesthetic mist," Maya breathed, recognizing it from her research on the ship's lore. Walter's file said it causes disorientation, memory loss. She immediately pulled the collar of her shirt over her face again. "Kellen, hurry." The mist was spreading quickly across the floor, thick and low-lying. Kellen worked with frantic energy, tearing at the ceiling panel. He managed to bend it far enough to create an opening, a dark, coffin-sized hole leading into the crawl space above. "Go," he yelled down to Maya. "Get Cole, I'll follow." The mist was already swirling around Maya's ankles. She grabbed the still whimpering Cole, pulling him to his feet. "Cole, you have to climb. Now, do you understand?" He looked at her, his eyes vacant, confused. The mist was affecting him, layering a new confusion over his existing terror. Maya slapped his face, a sharp, cracking sound. "Cole, climb." The sting seemed to break through the fog. He looked at the bed, then at the hole in the ceiling, and a flicker of survival instinct returned. He scrambled onto the bed. Maya pushed him from below, guiding his feet onto the frame. "Go, go." Cole clumsily pulled himself up into the opening, his legs dangling for a moment before he disappeared into the darkness above. "Maya, you next," Kellen urged from atop the bed frame. Maya coughed, the mist now swirling around her waist. She felt a wave of dizziness, the edges of the room softening. She climbed onto the bed, her movements becoming sluggish. She reached up and Kellen grabbed her hands, pulling her upward. Just as she cleared the opening, a new sound began in the room below. A wet, sloppy clicking. It was not mechanical. It was organic. From his vantage point, Kellen looked down. The anesthetic mist was thick now, a churning sea of gray fog filling the room to a depth of 3 feet. And moving within it just below the surface were shapes, multiple shapes. They were pale and segmented like enormous blind shrimp. The bilge crawlers. Walter had somehow diverted them, flushed them up from the lowest decks. They were scuttling across the floor, their long antennae twitching, drawn by the vibrations. "Let's go," Kellen yelled, pulling himself fully into the crawl space. He didn't wait to see more. The crawl space was a claustrophobic nightmare. A tight, 2-foot-high gap between the ceiling panels and the actual deck above. It was a labyrinth of pipes, conduits, and structural beams. The air was thick with the dust of ages, and every surface was coated in a layer of grime that felt greasy to the touch. They lay on their stomachs in the pitch-black darkness, listening to the scuttling sounds from the room they had just escaped. "Which way?" Maya whispered, her voice trembling next to him. "I don't know," Kellen admitted. Ahead of them he could hear Cole crawling, his movements frantic and clumsy. From the room below a new sound emerged, louder than the scuttling. It was a rhythmic, metallic thump. Thump, thump, thump. Someone was trying to break down the ceiling panel from below. No, not break it down, pushing it back into place. Then a voice right beneath them. Dr. Gideon Stern, the surgeon, but it was not a voice of words. It was a phantom sensation, a thought that felt like ice in their veins. "The patient is escaping. The patient must be retrieved." A hand punched through the ceiling panel next to Kellen's head. It was not a hand of flesh and blood. It was a shimmering, spectral hand, glowing with a faint, sickly white light. It was holding a rusted, archaic-looking bone saw. It blindly swept through the air, inches from Kellen's face, before retracting back into the room below. They had escaped the cage only to find themselves trapped in the walls, with the asylum's most monstrous guards. Chapter 7. The Galley's Offering. "Crawl," Kellen hissed, the word a plume of dust in the darkness. "Now." There was no thought, only instinct. They propelled themselves forward on elbows and knees, scraping their bodies against rusted pipes and sharp-edged beams. The crawlspace was a horizontal maze, a black, suffocating tunnel. Behind them, the spectral bone saw punched through another ceiling panel with a screech of tearing metal, its blind sawing filling the narrow space with a sound of pure menace. Ahead, Cole was moving with a panicked, desperate speed. They could hear his ragged breathing and the frantic scraping of his clothes on the metal. He was not thinking, just fleeing. A wounded animal running from a predator it could not comprehend. "Cole, slow down," Maya called out in a strained whisper. "We need to stick together." Her only answer was the sound of his receding panic. The crawlspace twisted and turned. Conduits as thick as pythons forced them to contort their bodies to get past. The air was dead, hot, and tasted of rust. Kellen's flashlight beam, jittery and weak, was their only guide, creating more confusing shadows than it illuminated. Every dark recess looked like an ambush point. Every drip of water from a leaky pipe sounded like a footstep. Suddenly, Cole's frantic crawling ahead of them stopped. They heard a sharp cry, followed by a loud crash and the sound of shattering material. Then, silence. "Cole," Kellen called out, his voice echoing unnaturally. He and Maya crawled faster, their own fears momentarily eclipsed by the unknown fate of their friend. They rounded a bend choked with thick electrical cables and saw it. A section of the ceiling had given way. Cole was gone. A gaping, jagged hole, about 5 feet across, opened into a cavernous blackness below. Flimsy, rotten ceiling tiles and rusted metal framework were all that remained of the floor of the crawlspace. They crawled to the edge of the hole and peered down. It was a straight drop of at least 15 feet. Kellen swept his light across the space below. They were above a huge two-story room. It was the ship's main galley. Massive stainless steel ovens and cooking ranges lined the walls, their surfaces dull with grime. Huge preparation tables stood like steel altars in the center of the room, and lying in a heap amidst a pile of shattered ceiling debris was Cole. He was groaning, conscious, but not moving. "Cole, can you hear me? Are you hurt?" Maya called down, her voice tight with anxiety. My ankle," he moaned from the darkness. "I think it's broken." Kellen cursed under his breath. A broken ankle, on a haunted ship controlled by a madman. Their situation had gone from critical to catastrophic. "Stay still," Kellen instructed. "We're coming down." He scanned the crawl space for anything they could use as a rope. The electrical cables were too thick and rigid. The pipes were immovable. There was nothing. "We have to jump," he said, his voice grim. "It's the only way." "Kellen, it's too far. We could break a leg too," Maya protested. "It's either that or we stay up here and wait for the ghost with the saw to find us," he shot back. "There's debris down there. It might cushion the fall." He didn't wait for an argument. He swung his legs over the edge, dangled for a second, and let go. He hit the ground hard, his knees buckling under the impact, sending a jarring shock up his spine. He landed in the pile of plaster and metal framework, which did little to soften the blow, but at least prevented him from hitting the solid steel floor directly. Pain flared in his right knee, but it was bearable. Nothing was broken. He scrambled to his feet and shone his light on Maya, who was still peering down from the hole above. "It's okay. Just bend your knees when you land." Maya hesitated for a moment, then followed. She landed more gracefully than he had, rolling as she hit the debris, a technique she must have learned in one of her many safety-first courses. She was on her feet in a second, rushing to Cole's side. His ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle, already beginning to swell. It was definitely broken. "We need to splint this," Maya said, her practical nature taking over. She began looking around the galley for anything they could use. The place was a wreck. Pots and pans, some as large as truck tires, were scattered across the floor. Racks of trays had toppled over, creating a chaotic jumble of metal. But amidst the chaos, there was a strange order. On one of the long preparation tables, several large, covered serving platters were arranged in a neat row, as if for a banquet. "What's this?" Kellen asked, approaching the table. "Don't touch anything," Maya warned, her attention still on Cole. Curiosity, or perhaps a subconscious hunger born from stress, got the better of Kellen. He reached out and lifted the lid of the nearest platter. The smell hit him first. It was not the smell of decay. It was rich, savory, and delicious. The smell of roasted meat. Under the lid was what appeared to be a perfectly cooked roast chicken, glistening under a coating of herbs. It looked so real, so appetizing, his stomach rumbled. "No way," he breathed. He lifted the second lid. A steaming pile of mashed potatoes, a pool of melted butter in its center. The third revealed green beans, glistening and fresh. It was a complete hot meal, laid out in the middle of a derelict ship that had been abandoned for decades. "Maya, you have to see this," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. Maya, having found a long metal spatula to use as a potential splint, looked over. Her eyes widened. "That's impossible." From the far side of the galley, a new figure emerged from the shadows of a deep pantry. It was a portly man in a sweat-stained cook's uniform and a tall, floppy chef's hat. He was translucent, his form wavering like a heat haze, but his smile was broad and friendly. He held a ladle in one hand. It was the ship's spectral cook. "Hungry?" the cook asked, his voice a warm, friendly boom that seemed to echo from the steel walls. "Always plenty for new arrivals. Eat up. It's important to keep your strength up." Cole, propped up against a table leg, stared at the food with a desperate, feverish hunger. "Food," he rasped. "I'm so hungry." "No," Maya said firmly, her eyes locked on the smiling ghost. "It's not real, it's a trick, like the nurse, like the room." The cook chuckled. "A trick? My cooking is the pride of the Mercy. Go on, just a taste." He gestured with his ladle toward the chicken. Despite Maya's warning, Kellen felt an overwhelming urge. His body craved the sustenance. The smell was intoxicating, promising warmth and energy. It felt like the first good thing that had happened since they boarded. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the roasted chicken. "Kellen, don't!" Maya shouted. Her shout broke the spell. Kellen snatched his hand back as if burned. He looked at the food again, forcing himself to see it not as a meal, but as another one of Walter's therapeutic tools. What sickness was this meant to treat? Despair? Hopelessness? He shone his flashlight directly onto the chicken. The beam was bright, clinical. Under the intense light, the illusion flickered. For a split second, the golden-brown skin of the roast became a writhing mass of pale maggots. The savory steam became a foul, green vapor. The mashed potatoes shimmered, their surface crawling with what looked like tiny white worms. Kellen gagged and stumbled back, knocking a stack of trays to the floor with a deafening crash. The cook's friendly smile faltered. His form flickered violently, his kindly face momentarily twisting into a mask of snarling rage. "Don't like my cooking," he boomed, his voice now a monstrous roar. "Ungrateful." He raised his ladle and charged. He moved with surprising speed for a ghost, gliding over the debris-strewn floor. He wasn't aiming for Kellen or Maya. He was heading for Cole, the most vulnerable among them. "Help him," Kellen yelled. Maya was already moving. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from a nearby countertop and swung it with all her might. The skillet passed straight through the cook's shimmering form with no effect. The ghost didn't even slow down. He reached Cole and raised the ladle high. It began to glow with a dull, heated red like metal left in a forge. He was not going to serve Cole, he was going to brand him. Chapter 8: The Morgue's Logic. Just as the glowing ladle began its descent, Kellen acted. He didn't attack the ghost. He attacked the illusion. With a desperate roar, he lunged at the preparation table, sweeping his arm across its surface. The platters of phantom food crashed to the floor. The roast chicken, the potatoes, the beans, they all vanished in midair, their delicious aroma instantly replaced by the stagnant, metallic tang of the galley. The moment the illusion broke, the spectral cook froze. The red glow of his ladle faded. His enraged expression slackened into one of confusion. He looked down at his empty hands, then around the now barren galley, as if he had forgotten why he was there. His form flickered, grew fainter, and with a final, mournful sigh that sounded like steam escaping a pipe, he dissolved completely, fading back into the shadows of the pantry. A heavy silence descended, broken only by Cole's terrified, shallow breathing. "It's tied to the objects," Maya said, her mind working furiously. She lowered the skillet she was still holding. The nurse had the bed, the cook had the food, their power, their presence. It's anchored to a purpose. If we disrupt the purpose, they weaken. It was a crucial discovery, a potential weapon in their fight for survival. But it was small comfort. They were still trapped in the galley with a severely injured man, and they knew Walter would not leave them alone for long. "We need to move," Kellen said, his knee throbbing from his jump. "We can't stay here." He went to Cole's side. "Can you stand if we support you?" Cole shook his head, his face pale and slick with sweat. "I can't. Every time I move, it's like a knife in my bone." They were stuck. Moving Cole would be slow and agonizing for him and for them. Leaving him was not an option. "Then we fortify," Maya declared. "We find a defensible room and we barricade the door." The galley had several exits. The main double doors leading back into the ship's corridors, a smaller door likely leading to a pantry, and a dumbwaiter shaft with its doors hanging open. The main doors were their best bet for escape, but they were also the most obvious point of attack. "The pantry," Kellen said, pointing. "It's smaller, only one way in. We can block it." Working together, they managed to get Cole to his feet. He screamed as his weight settled on his broken ankle, but with Kellen and Maya supporting him on either side, they managed to half carry, half drag him toward the pantry door. The pantry was a small, windowless room, about 10 feet by 10 feet, lined with empty metal shelves from floor to ceiling. It was a dead end, a perfect trap or a perfect fortress, depending on your perspective. They helped Cole to the floor, propping him up against the far wall. "The tables," Maya said. "Help me move one of the tables." The huge stainless steel preparation tables were immensely heavy, but fueled by adrenaline. They managed to shove one across the galley floor, its legs screeching, until it was wedged firmly against the pantry door. It wasn't a perfect barricade, but it would slow Walter down. It would buy them time. Time for what? Kellen wondered. Time to wait for another, more horrible monster to phase through the walls. Inside the cramped pantry, they finally had a moment to breathe. Maya turned her attention back to Cole's ankle. Using the metal spatula she'd found and tearing strips of cloth from the hem of her own shirt, she began to fashion a crude but effective splint. Her movements were calm and efficient, a small island of order in a sea of chaos. Kellen stood guard by the blocked door, listening. The ship was quiet again, too quiet. The silence was more unnerving than the noises. It meant Walter was thinking, planning. "Why us?" Cole whispered from the floor, his eyes glassy with pain and fear. "Why is he doing this to us?" He told us, Maya said, not looking up from her work as she tightened a bandage. He thinks he's treating us. The cook, the food. It was a test, for despair. He wanted to see if we'd give in and accept the illusion, if we'd choose a pleasant lie over a painful reality. And we passed his test, Kellen said bitterly. What do we win? A new nightmare. As if in answer, a voice echoed through the galley, seeming to come from all directions at once. It was Walter's voice, but it was not coming from just outside the door. It was broadcast, tinny and distorted, as if speaking through an old intercom system. Excellent progress, the voice crackled. The patients have rejected false comforts and have taken proactive steps to secure their environment. This marks the end of the second phase of therapy, acclimatization. The voice was calm, clinical, like a doctor dictating notes. We now proceed to phase 3, confrontation. The patient, Cole, suffers from a physical trauma that mirrors his psychological fragility. The other two patients, Kellen and Maya, exhibit codependent protective behaviors that inhibit the primary patient's self-reliance. This must be addressed. A loud clanking sound echoed from the galley, followed by a rhythmic metallic squeak. The dumbwaiter. Kellen and Maya exchanged a look of horror. They had barricaded the door, but they had forgotten the other opening in the room. The objective of this phase, Walter's voice continued, is to force the patients to confront the physical realities of their situation. The source of all physical suffering on this vessel was, ultimately, the morgue. It was the final destination, the place of absolute truth. Therefore, the necessary medical supplies to treat the patient's injury can be found there. The dumbwaiter reached their floor with a final, heavy thud. Its metal doors, which had been hanging ajar, slowly slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Inside the small lift, illuminated by a single bare bulb that flickered to life, was a gurney. On the gurney was a map of the ship, crudely drawn on a piece of yellowed parchment. A single location was circled in red ink: morgue. Next to the map lay a single gleaming object, a hacksaw. Walter's voice returned, its tone now holding a note of grim finality. You have 1 hour to retrieve the medical supplies. If you fail, the primary patient's condition will become septic. The infection will spread. If you succeed, well, that is the point of the test, isn't it? The intercom clicked off. The bulb in the dumbwaiter flickered and died, plunging the galley back into darkness, relieved only by their flashlights. The hacksaw on the gurney seemed to absorb the light, its serrated teeth promising a terrible choice. They were being given a quest, a timed, gruesome fetch quest with Cole's life as the stakes. Walter had created a problem, Cole's broken ankle, and was now providing a horrific potential solution. What medical supplies were in a morgue? Embalming fluid, autopsy tools. The choice was clear, they had to go, but what was the hacksaw for? It was too small for doors, it wasn't for defense. Kellen's blood ran cold as he realized its intended purpose. It was a surgical tool. Walter wasn't just testing their courage. He was testing how far they would go to survive. He was giving them the tool to perform their own amputation. Chapter 9. The Chain Draggers Do. The map was their Bible and their curse. It was drawn with a shaky but precise hand on the back of an old naval inventory sheet. The ink was faded, the paper brittle. Maya spread it out on the floor of the pantry, her flashlight beam illuminating its stark, simple lines. "He's playing a game with us," Kellen spat, his voice a low growl. He paced the tiny room like a caged tiger. "A sick, twisted game." "Of course he is," Maya replied, her tone sharp and focused. She was tracing a route on the map with her finger. "But it's a game with rules. He's telling us where to go. He's giving us a timeline. That means there's a solution, a way to win." "Win, Maya, he left us a hacksaw. What do you think the prize is?" Maya didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the map. The galley was on deck 2. The morgue was on deck 1 near the stern. The map showed 2 routes. One was a direct path through the main corridors, marked with a thick black line. The other was a winding, circuitous route through service tunnels and storage areas, marked with a faint, dotted line. "Why 2 routes?" Kellen asked, peering over her shoulder. "A choice," Maya deduced. "The direct route is faster but probably more dangerous. The service tunnels are slower, safer. Another test. Does brute force win or does caution?" A low groan from the corner drew their attention. Cole was shivering, his face pale and clammy. The pain in his ankle was radiating up his leg. "You can't. Leave me here," he whispered. "We're not leaving you," Maya assured him, though her voice lacked conviction. "We're getting help." She looked at Kellen, her expression was grim. "We have to go, and we have to be fast. I'll go. You stay here with him." "No," Kellen said immediately. "Walter mentioned codependency. He wants to separate us. It's part of the test. We go together. Cole." He looked at his injured friend, a wave of guilt washing over him. "Cole, we're going to block this door as best we can. We'll be back in less than an hour." Cole just shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. "He'll get in. The cook got in." "The cook was a ghost," Kellen said, trying to sound confident. "Walter is a man. He can't walk through walls." They spent 5 precious minutes reinforcing their barricade. They shoved empty shelves against the heavy table, creating a dense web of metal that would be difficult and noisy to breach. It was a flimsy defense, but it was all they had. "We're taking the direct route," Kellen decided, grabbing the hacksaw and the map. "We don't have time for sightseeing in the tunnels." Maya nodded in agreement. Caution was a luxury they could no longer afford. They slipped out of the pantry, leaving Cole alone in the dark, and pushed the heavy table back into place. The sound of it scraping across the floor felt like the closing of a tomb. Armed with the map, they navigated the dark, silent galley and pushed through the main double doors. They were now in a wide corridor that ran the length of the ship. It was eerily silent. The air was cold and still. According to the map, they had to head toward the stern and find a stairwell leading down to deck 1. They moved at a fast walk, their flashlight beams cutting cones of light through the oppressive darkness. Every intersecting corridor, every open doorway was a potential ambush point. The silence was a taut string, ready to snap. After about 100 yards, they heard it. It started as a faint, rhythmic sound from far behind them. A heavy, dragging noise, chink, scrape, chink, scrape. "What's that?" Maya whispered, stopping. Kellen listened, his blood running cold. The chain dragger, the mutineer from the brig, the guidebook app on my phone mentioned him. His voice was a strained whisper. They say he was dragged to the gallows in chains. The sound grew louder, closer. It was methodical, unhurried. The sound of something heavy and inexorable approaching. They started to run. Their boots pounded on the steel deck, the sound deafening in the silence. The dragging noise behind them seemed to quicken its pace, matching their own. It was not a mindless haunting. It was a pursuit. The map showed the main stairwell was just ahead, around a corner. They rounded it at a full sprint and saw the opening, a gaping black square leading down. But something was standing at the top of the stairs, blocking their path. It was Agnes Croft, the matron. She stood perfectly still, her hands folded at her waist, her pale face a mask of stern disapproval. She was not looking at them, but at the corridor from which they had just come, as if waiting for the thing that was chasing them. "She's blocking us," Kellen panted, skidding to a halt. The chinking and scraping was very close now, just around the corner. "We have to go through her," Maya said, her jaw set. Kellen remembered the feeling of suffocation, the crushing pressure of her silent command. "She'll stop us." "Her power is in order, in rules," Maya reasoned, her mind racing. "Shouting, noise, that's what triggered her. This time we do it her way." The dragging sound was almost upon them. "Walk," Maya commanded. "Don't run, look straight ahead, don't look at her." We are two people calmly proceeding to the next deck. There is no chaos, no panic. It was an insane idea, a gamble based on a half-formed theory. But it was their only option. Kellen took a deep breath, forcing his racing heart to slow. He and Maya turned and began to walk, side by side, directly toward the spectral nurse. They kept their pace steady, their eyes fixed on the darkness of the stairwell behind her. The dragging sound was deafening now. It was just feet behind them. An overwhelming aura of rage and injustice washed over them, a psychic wave that threatened to buckle their knees. They could feel the chain dragger's presence, a cold spot in the air, a weight of centuries of bitterness. They were now 5 feet from the matron. Her head turned slowly, her dark, empty eyes fixing on them. The air grew thick, cold. Kellen felt the familiar pressure on his chest, the beginning of suffocation. He fought the urge to gasp, to run. He kept walking. They were about to pass her. The pressure was immense. His lungs burned. Just as they drew level with her, she raised a single, translucent finger to her lips. As they change. The soundless command lanced into their minds. But this time, it was not directed at them. It was aimed at the corridor behind them. At that exact moment, they passed her and plunged into the darkness of the stairwell. The pressure on their chests vanished. Behind them, the furious, dragging sound stopped abruptly, as if it had hit a solid wall. They didn't look back. They scrambled down the metal stairs, their footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. They had made it. Maya's gamble had paid off. They had used the ship's rules against itself, pitting one haunting against another. They reached the bottom of the stairs and found themselves on deck 1. It was colder here, the air damp and smelling of seawater and brine. This was the bowels of the ship. According to the map, the morgue was at the end of this corridor. As they started to move, a sound echoed from the stairwell above them. It was a terrible, wet, tearing sound, followed by a heavy, meaty thud. Then another, and another. A slow, rhythmic dripping began to echo down the stairs. Drip, drip, drip. Maya shone her flashlight back up the stairwell. Her beam illuminated the top landing. The matron and the chain dragger were gone, but hanging from the ceiling, suspended by their ankles from spectral chains, were two human bodies. They were dressed in the tattered remains of urban exploration gear. One of them had a familiar, cheap backpack. It was another team, or perhaps just a lone scavenger. Kellen recognized the gear. It belonged to Wreck Rat Ricky, their rival who had a reputation for following other explorers to steal their glory. He must have snuck aboard after them. The bodies were horribly mutilated, torn apart by some unseen force. Blood dripped from them onto the landing, pooling before running in a slow, thick rivulet down the top step. The ship wasn't just haunted, it was a trap, and it was hungry. Ricky and his partner had broken the matron's rule of silence, and the chain dragger had delivered the punishment. Their gruesome fate was a warning. The rules were real, and the penalty for breaking them was death. Chapter 10: The Drawer of Echoes. The sight of Ricky's mutilated corpse broke something in Kellen. The vlogger, the thrill-seeker, the man who had called this place a masterpiece, was gone, burned away by the acid of genuine terror. All that remained was a man trapped in a charnel house, a man who wanted to live. He tore his eyes away from the grisly tableau in the stairwell and grabbed Maya's arm. "Move," he croaked, his voice raw. "Just move." They stumbled down the deck one corridor away from the dripping sound. The architecture here was different, more utilitarian. The walls were bare steel, sweating with condensation. Exposed pipes ran everywhere, hissing and gurgling with the ship's secret fluids. The deck beneath their feet was slick with a thin film of seawater and grime. The air was heavy, salty. They were below the waterline. The corridor stretched out before them, a long, dark throat. The map showed the morgue was the last door on the left. As they walked, they passed other doors, their labels stark and ominous. Engine room, bilge pump access, GNERATORIUM. From behind the generator room door, they could hear a low, steady thrumming, the ship's humming heart. Finally, they reached it, the last door. It was a heavy, refrigerated steel door with a small, circular window of thick, wire-reinforced glass, now clouded with grime. A simple plaque was bolted to it. Morgue. There was no lock, only a heavy lever handle. Kellen looked at Maya. This was it, the goal of their gruesome quest. He took a deep breath, the cold, damp air doing little to steady his nerves. He gripped the lever. It was freezing cold, the chill seeping through his glove. He pushed down. With a heavy, sucking sound, the vacuum seal broke and the door swung inward. A wave of cold air washed over them, far colder than the corridor. It was a dead, sterile cold, laced with the faint, chemical scent of formaldehyde. They stepped inside, their flashlight beams cutting through the absolute black. The room was exactly what they had feared. It was small, stark, and tiled in white from floor to ceiling, though the tiles were now cracked and yellowed. In the center of the room stood a single, slanted metal table with a drain at one end. An autopsy table. Against the far wall was a bank of refrigerated body drawers, a wall of small, square metal doors, 12 of them in total. "The supplies have to be in one of these," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. "Okay," Kellen said, trying to sound methodical. "We start at the top, work our way down, one by one." He handed the hacksaw to Maya and approached the wall of drawers. He pulled the handle of the top left drawer, number 1. It slid out with a smooth, well-oiled sound that was somehow more disturbing than if it had been rusted shut. The drawer was empty, a bare, cold metal slab. He pushed it shut and moved to number 2. He pulled. This one was also empty, and number 3 and 4. Relief began to mingle with their fear. Maybe this was the test. Maybe there was nothing here. Maybe it was just about having the courage to look. He reached for drawer number 5. He pulled the handle. This one felt different. It was heavier. It didn't slide smoothly. It came out with a low, scraping groan. The drawer was not empty. Lying on the slab was a body, or what was left of one. It was ancient, mummified by the cold, a sailor in a rotting naval uniform. His skin was like tanned leather stretched tight over a skeleton, his eye sockets empty, his mouth open in a silent scream. But that wasn't the most horrifying part. Lying on the sailor's chest, placed deliberately, was a small, leather-bound medical kit, the kind a battlefield medic would carry. "The supplies," Maya breathed. Kellen reached for the kit. His fingers brushed against the dry, papery fabric of the sailor's uniform. The moment he touched it, the sailor's head snapped toward him. The jaw, which had been locked open, creaked shut with an audible click. A low moan emanated from the body, a dry, dusty sound, the exhalation of air that had been trapped in its lungs for half a century. Kellen yelled and scrambled backward, falling to the floor. He dropped his flashlight, which rolled away, its beam spinning wildly around the room. The corpse began to sit up. Its movements were stiff, jerky, like a marionette with tangled strings. It pushed itself into a sitting position on the slab, its empty eye sockets fixed on Kellen. "What is it doing?" Maya cried out, backing away toward the door. The corpse was not looking at Kellen with malice. It raised a single, skeletal hand and pointed a bony finger at the medical kit still resting on the drawer slab. Then it pointed at its own chest. It opened its mouth, and this time a word came out, a dry, rattling whisper that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Help!" It wasn't attacking them. It was a patient, a ghost trapped in its own dead body, forever seeking aid for the wound that killed it. Kellen, still on the floor, understood. This was another of Walter's therapeutic tableaus. He was showing them the ultimate patient, the one for whom help would never come. "The kit," he stammered, pointing. "Get the kit, Maya." Maya, seeing the creature was not advancing, cautiously approached the open drawer. The corpse remained sitting up, its empty gaze following her, its skeletal hand still pointing. She snatched the medical kit off the slab. The moment the kit was removed, the corpse stopped. Its hand fell. Its head slumped forward. And then, with a slow, final sigh, the entire body disintegrated. It did not turn to dust in a dramatic puff, but simply collapsed in on itself, the uniform, the skin, the bones all crumbling into a heap of fine, gray powder and rotten cloth. The haunting was over. The echo had faded. Maya clutched the kit to her chest, her breathing ragged. She opened it. Inside, nestled in velvet slots, were not bandages or antiseptics. There were 3 large, sealed glass vials filled with a thick, syrupy, amber-colored liquid. The labels were handwritten in a looping, archaic script. They read, "Sedative, for extreme cases only." It wasn't a cure, it wasn't a first aid kit. It was a powerful tranquilizer, enough to knock a man out for hours, perhaps permanently. This was Walter's solution, not to fix Cole's leg, but to silence him, to chemically restrain him when the physical restraints had failed. Suddenly, a metallic clang echoed from the corridor outside. It was the sound of the heavy pantry door in the galley hitting the floor. It was followed by a single, pain-filled scream. Cole's scream. Their hour was up. Walter had gotten to him. Kellen and Maya looked at each other, a new, cold dread dawning in their eyes. They had passed the test. They had retrieved the medicine. But while they were facing the ghosts of the past, Walter had been dealing with the present. They had left Cole alone and defenseless, and now they were too late. Chapter 11. The Caretaker's Diagnosis. Cole's scream was a physical thing. It clawed its way down the long, damp corridor from the galley, a sound of pure agony that cut through the sterile silence of the morgue. It was followed by a heavy, dragging sound. "He's moving him," Kellen said, scrambling to his feet. The dust from the disintegrated corpse still hung in the air, catching in his throat. "He's taking him somewhere." Maya slammed the medical kit shut. The 3 vials of amber liquid rattled inside. "The map," she said, her voice urgent. She fumbled for the parchment, spreading it on the cold autopsy table. "If we know where he's taking him, we might be able to cut him off." Her finger traced the lines, her mind racing, connecting the pieces of Walter's twisted logic. He wouldn't take him back to the restraint room. That failed. The galley was a test site. Where would a doctor take a patient who is physically injured and mentally unstable? Kellen's eyes met hers. They both knew the answer. It was the only place left that made a horrible kind of sense. "The operating theater," Kellen breathed. Maya's finger found it on the map. Deck 3, main surgical suite, directly above the central section of the ship. "He's taking him to Dr. Stern." The thought was paralyzing. The spectral surgeon with his invisible scalpels and his insatiable need to complete his work. Walter wasn't just moving Cole. He was delivering him to an executioner. "We have to go. Now." Kellen grabbed the heavy morgue door, but Maya put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Wait," she said, her eyes narrowed in thought. "Kellen, we can't beat him. He knows this ship better than we know our own homes. He controls it. Trying to fight him on his terms, playing his game. We just keep losing." "So what do we do, Maya? Let him butcher Cole?" "No," she said, her gaze hardening. "We stop playing his game. We start playing ours." She tapped the generator room on the map. "He controls the ship because it has power. The restraints, the dumbwaiter, the intercom, probably even the locks on the doors. It's all running on an auxiliary generator. A new, desperate hope dawned on Kellen. You're saying we cut the power. I'm saying we cut the head off the snake, she corrected. No power, no control. The ship becomes just a ship again, a piece of dead metal. He loses his greatest weapon. It was a brilliant, desperate gambit, a direct assault on the source of their torment. The generator is on this deck, Kellen said, looking at the map. Not far from here. Then that's where we go, Maya declared. She took one of the vials from the medical kit, its amber fluid seeming to glow in the beam of her flashlight. And we have this. If we get into a corner, this is our emergency exit. A tranquilizer bomb for one of them, or a chemical weapon against Walter. They slipped out of the morgue. The corridor was empty. The dragging sounds and Cole's screams had faded. They had a small window of time. They broke into a run, their footsteps splashing in the thin layer of water on the deck, heading not for the stairs to save Cole, but for the heart of the ship's power. The generator room door was a thick steel hatch with a small, circular porthole, similar to the one on the morgue. A sign stenciled in faded red letters read, "Danger, high voltage, authorized personnel only." Kellen peered through the grimy porthole. Inside, a single massive diesel generator the size of a small truck sat in the center of the room. It was a beast of cast iron and faded green paint, and it was running. A low, steady thrum vibrated through the glass, the source of the ship's constant humming. Thick, armored cables snaked from it into the walls and ceiling, the arteries of the Mercy. The door was locked with a heavy, industrial deadbolt. There was no breaking it down with a crowbar. "There has to be another way in," Kellen muttered, running his hands along the seams of the door. Maya was already scanning the area. Her light fell on a maintenance panel on the wall a few feet away. Here, a fuel line conduit. She pried the panel open. Inside was a tangle of pipes and wiring, but one pipe about 6 inches in diameter was labeled diesel fuel intake. It ran from the panel and disappeared through a sealed hole into the generator room. "If we can shut off the fuel, the generator will die," she said. She grabbed a valve wheel on the pipe and tried to turn it. It was frozen solid with rust. "Let me," Kellen said. He gripped the wheel with both hands and threw his weight into it. The valve groaned, a high-pitched metallic shriek of protest. He strained, his muscles bunching. With a final, explosive crack, the rust seal broke and the wheel turned. They heard a gurgling sound as the fuel supply was cut off. They watched through the porthole. For about 30 seconds, the generator continued to hum steadily, consuming the fuel left in its lines. Then, the rhythm began to falter. The steady thrum became a stuttering cough. The lights inside the room flickered. The hum dropped in pitch, becoming a dying groan. With a final, shuddering gasp, the generator died. And the ship went silent. It was a silence unlike any they had experienced before. The constant, low-frequency hum that had been the background noise of their entire ordeal was gone. The absence of it was deafening. The ship felt truly dead for the first time, a hollow iron shell. A series of heavy, metallic clunks echoed down the corridor, as electronic locks disengaged throughout the vessel. "It worked," Kellen breathed, a grin spreading across his face. It actually worked. "We're not done yet," Maya cautioned, but even she felt a surge of triumph. They had wounded the beast. They ran back down the corridor and scrambled up the main stairwell, past the gruesome, dripping display of Ricky's fate. They emerged onto Deck 2, then immediately found the next set of stairs leading up to Deck 3. The operating suite was located in the center of the deck. As they approached, they heard a voice. It was Walter, and he sounded confused. "Power failure," he was muttering to himself. "Auxiliary systems offline, unscheduled, impossible." They rounded the corner and saw him. He was standing in front of the large, double doors of the main operating theater. Cole was slumped on the floor next to him, conscious but barely, his face a mess of tears and sweat. Walter was no longer looking at his patient. He was staring up at a dead light fixture on the ceiling, his brow furrowed in consternation. He was a king who had just discovered his castle had crumbled around him. Seeing his confusion, his vulnerability, Kellen acted. He charged. He hit Walter with the full force of his body, a flying tackle that sent the older man crashing against the operating theater doors. The pipe wrench flew from Walter's grasp, skittering across the floor. Kellen was on top of him, his hands grabbing the front of Walter's filthy gown, his face inches from the madman. "It's over," Kellen snarled, adrenaline surging through him. "Your games are done." Walter stared up at him, but there was no fear in his pale blue eyes. There was only a profound, chilling sadness. "You foolish child," Walter whispered, his voice raspy. "You think that power was for me." He looked past Kellen toward the doors of the operating theater. It was for them, to keep them calm, to regulate them. Behind Kellen, Maya, who had rushed to check on Cole, suddenly gasped, "Kellen, the doors." Kellen looked over his shoulder. The heavy theater doors, which Walter had been trying to open, were now slowly swinging inward on their own. The power outage had disengaged the magnetic locks that kept them sealed. A cold, sterile wind blew out from the darkness within, carrying the scent of rubbing alcohol and old blood. And from the blackness, a sound emerged. The soft, methodical clinking of surgical tools being arranged on a metal tray. Dr. Gideon Stern was aware. He knew a patient had been delivered, and now his doors were open. Walter started to laugh, a low, gurgling sound of despair. "You didn't turn off my weapon," he choked out, a mad grin spreading across his face. "You opened their cages." Chapter 12. Unlicensed Practice. The darkness of the operating theater was not empty. It was a living, breathing entity, a void that pulsed with decades of concentrated suffering. The clinking of unseen tools grew louder, more insistent. It was the sound of a monstrous appetite being whetted. Kellen scrambled off Walter, his brief moment of triumph curdling into icy dread. He had thought he was disarming a bomb, but he had only armed a bigger one. Walter remained on the floor, his quiet, despairing laughter a new and terrifying soundtrack to their doom. "Cole," Maya said, her voice strained as she tried to pull the injured man away from the open doors. "Get up. We have to move." Cole was barely responsive, his mind lost in a fog of pain and terror. He was dead weight. From the blackness of the theater, a shape began to resolve. It was not a full figure. It was a pair of hands floating in the air at chest height. They were spectral, shimmering with a faint, necrotic light, and they were stained to the wrist with what looked like old, dried blood. They were the hands of Dr. Gideon Stern. They hovered just inside the doorway, one hand holding a long, thin, spectral scalpel that glinted as it caught the light from Maya's flashlight. The hands were not interested in Kellen or Maya. Their focus, their entire intent was fixed on the injured man on the floor, the patient. "He sees the ankle," Walter whispered from the floor, his laughter subsiding into a grim running commentary. "A compound fracture, unstable, requires immediate surgical intervention." The spectral hands glided out of the theater, moving with a terrifying, fluid grace. They advanced on Cole, the scalpel held forward like a duelist's rapier. "Get back," Kellen yelled, grabbing the heavy pipe wrench from the floor. He swung it with all his might at the floating hands. The wrench passed straight through them, the illusion offering no resistance. The hands didn't even pause. They were a force of pure intent, and their intent was to heal. Maya, seeing the physical attack had failed, remembered her lesson from the galley. Disrupt the purpose. She shone her flashlight beam directly into Cole's face. "Cole, wake up, there is nothing wrong with you," she yelled, her voice echoing in the corridor. "Your ankle is fine, you are not the patient, walk away." Cole's eyes fluttered. He looked at the approaching hands, at the gleaming scalpel, and a fresh wave of terror gave him a burst of strength. He tried to scramble backward, away from the spectral surgeon. It didn't work. Dr. Stern was not an illusion to be broken by disbelief. He was an echo of a man who saw a wound that needed fixing. Cole's very real, very broken ankle was the anchor for this haunting. It was the purpose. The hands reached Cole. The spectral scalpel descended. Cole screamed, a high, thin sound of absolute horror as the invisible blade touched his leg. Though it was an apparition, the pain was real. A thin, perfectly straight line of blood welled up on his trousers just above the ankle. "Stop it," Kellen roared, swinging the wrench again and again, his blows passing harmlessly through the phantom limbs. Walter watched from the floor, his face a mask of clinical detachment. A fascinating complication. The patient is conscious during the procedure. This will negatively impact recovery. Maya saw it then, the true nature of Walter's twisted therapy. He hadn't been trying to kill them with the ship's horrors. He had been trying to prepare them, to teach them the rules. The matron taught them silence. The cook taught them to reject illusion. The morgue taught them acceptance of death. He was giving them the tools to survive the things he couldn't control. And by cutting the power, they had skipped the final lesson. They were facing the final exam without having studied. The spectral scalpel lifted, ready for a second cut. Cole was convulsing on the floor, his screams turning into wet, choked gurgles. Maya made a decision. She pulled the vial of amber sedative from her pocket. She fumbled with the wax seal, her fingers clumsy with panic. She broke it open. "Kellen, the wrench," she shouted. He looked at her, uncomprehending. "The floor, hit the floor, make a noise, a loud one," she commanded. Kellen, acting on pure instinct, swung the heavy pipe wrench down onto the steel deck. The impact was deafening, a booming clang that reverberated through the corridor like a thunderclap. The effect was instantaneous. From down the hall, from the direction of the stairwell, a new sound arose, the furious, vengeful scraping of the chain dragger. And from the opposite direction, a cold wind blew, carrying the oppressive, breathless aura of Agnes Croft. They had rung the dinner bell for every predator on the ship. The floating hands of Dr. Stern paused. The presence of the other entities, the sheer volume of the noise, seemed to interfere with its concentration. It was a moment's hesitation, but it was enough. Maya lunged forward. She didn't try to inject coal. She threw the entire contents of the open vial onto the spectral hands. The thick, syrupy liquid splashed across the phantom limbs. It did not pass through. It clung to them, a thick, amber goo. The sedative, a tool of modern medicine, was anathema to the old-world surgeon. The hands began to smoke, a foul, sizzling sound filling the air. They spasmed violently, dropping the spectral scalpel, which vanished before it hit the floor. The hands clawed at themselves, trying to wipe away the clinging fluid, before flickering erratically and receding back into the darkness of the operating theater. The heavy doors swung shut with a deep, final boom, as if the theater itself were recoiling in pain. They had driven it back, but now they had a far greater problem. The scraping of the chains was closer. The matron's suffocating presence was bearing down on them. They were caught in a pincer movement of spectral rage. Walter Hemlock slowly got to his feet. He looked down the corridor in one direction, then the other. He shook his head with a sigh. "Class is over," he said softly. He looked at Kellen and Maya with his pale, lucid eyes. "And you have failed the test." He turned and began to walk away, not running but moving with a deliberate stride down a small, unmarked service corridor they hadn't noticed before. He was abandoning them to the consequences of their actions. He was leaving them to the things the power had held in check. Chapter 13. Rats in the Walls. "Where is he going?" Kellen yelled, watching Walter disappear into the service corridor. "It doesn't matter," Maya shouted back, her voice tight with panic. She grabbed Kellen's arm, pulling him toward Cole. "Help me get him up. We have to hide." The scraping of the chain dragger was just around the corner now, a sound that promised violent retribution. The suffocating cold of the matron was a physical weight, pressing in from the other direction. They were trapped in the corridor with nowhere to run. Kellen and Maya hauled Cole to his feet. He was barely conscious, his head lolling, his body a dead weight. The perfect, bloody line on his leg was a stark reminder of how close he had come to a spectral amputation. "In here," Kellen said, spotting a small door labeled Utility Closet. He threw his shoulder against it. The lock, disengaged by the power outage, clicked open. They half-dragged Cole inside and tumbled in after him, pulling the door shut just as the hulking, shadowy form of the chain dragger rounded the corner. Through the crack in the door they saw it, a massive, brutal-looking spirit, dragging a length of heavy, rusted anchor chain fused to its wrists. Its face was a mask of pure, undiluted rage. It stopped, its head turning, sensing them. From the other end of the corridor, Agnes Croft glided into view, her white uniform a beacon in the gloom. The two entities, the embodiments of order and chaos, advanced toward each other, with the utility closet trapped directly between them. The closet was tiny, barely large enough for the three of them. It smelled of ozone and dust and was filled with mops, buckets, and shelves of cleaning chemicals. They huddled in the darkness, not daring to breathe. The chain dragger and the matron met directly in front of their door. For a moment, nothing happened. The two spectral forces seemed to be locked in a silent, invisible struggle. The air in the corridor crackled with energy. Then the chain dragger let out a roar, a sound that was not sound but a wave of pure psychic violence. It swung its heavy chain in a wide arc. The matron did not flinch. She simply raised her hand. The chain passed through her, striking the wall behind her with a deafening clang that sent shivers through the steel of their hiding place. The matron, her purpose of enforcing quiet paramount, glided forward, passing through the enraged spirit. She continued down the corridor and vanished. Her job was done. She had confronted the source of the noise. The chain dragger, its rage unabated, was now alone in the corridor. It seemed confused, its target gone. It paced back and forth, dragging its chain, the scraping sound a torment to the people hiding just inches away. It knew something was near. It stopped directly in front of their door, its massive, shadowy head tilting as if listening. Kellen held his breath. He could feel its malevolent presence pressing against the thin metal of the door. A new sound began, a faint scratching from within the walls of the closet. At first, Kellen thought he was imagining it, but it grew louder. A frantic, skittering sound. It was coming from all around them, from behind the shelves, from inside the walls, from beneath the floor. Maya heard it too. Her eyes widened in the darkness. The rats. The pharmacopoeia rats. The mutated, hyper-aggressive spawn of the ship's dispensary. The power outage had not just freed the ghosts, it had opened their cages too. They had been contained within the walls and service tunnels, but now the electromagnetic locks on their containment zones were dead. A small, hairless rat with twitching whiskers squeezed through a crack in the wall near the floor. Then another, and another. They were pouring into the closet, their small, red eyes gleaming in the faint light from the corridor. They were not scared. They moved with a horrifying, unified purpose. The chain dragger outside seemed to sense them. It let out a low growl and, its attention diverted, began to move away down the corridor, as if it, too, feared the vermin. But for the people in the closet, the relief was short-lived. They were now locked in a tiny, dark space that was rapidly filling with dozens, then hundreds, of fearless, mutated rats. They swarmed over their shoes, their legs. Their tiny claws scrabbled at their clothes. Cole, who had been semi-conscious, let out a terrified shriek as a rat ran across his face. The sound acted like a trigger. The swarm surged. A rat leaped onto Kellen's arm, its teeth sinking into his glove. He yelled and flung it off. Another one bit into Maya's leg, its sharp incisors piercing her jeans. She cried out in pain and kicked it away. It was a nightmare, a writhing, squeaking sea of flesh and teeth. They were being consumed by inches. The shelves, Maya screamed over the chaos. Climb the shelves. It was their only hope. Kellen grabbed onto a metal shelf and began to pull himself up, rats clinging to his legs. He kicked wildly, trying to dislodge them. Maya was right behind him, trying to boost a terrified Cole. Kellen reached the top shelf, just below the ceiling. He lay on his stomach, kicking at the rats still trying to climb up his legs. He reached down to help Maya. She was halfway up, but Cole was struggling, too weak and injured to climb. The rats were swarming over him, their squeaks of excitement rising in pitch. He was being overcome. "Leave me," Cole screamed, his voice choked with terror and pain. "Just go." "No," Maya yelled, trying to haul him up, but she was losing her grip. A large, particularly vicious-looking rat, its skin scarred and hairless, leaped from a lower shelf and sank its teeth into Maya's outstretched hand. She screamed, a sharp, piercing cry of agony, and her hand slipped. Cole fell back into the writhing mass. The rats covered him in a single, horrific wave. His screams were abruptly cut off, replaced by a sickening, wet, tearing sound. Maya stared in horror, her bitten hand bleeding freely. Kellen grabbed her, pulling her the rest of the way onto the top shelf just as the tide of vermin surged upward. They lay there, crammed against the ceiling, feet tucked up, while just below them the swarm consumed their friend. The ordeal lasted less than a minute. Then, as quickly as they had come, the rats began to recede. Their purpose served, their hunger sated. They poured back into the cracks in the walls, vanishing, leaving behind a horrifying, blood-soaked stillness. Kellen and Maya lay on the shelf, trembling, covered in filth and blood, listening to the silence. The ghost had been a terror. The madman had been a monster. But the rats were a force of nature. A mindless, gnawing plague that had stripped away their hope and left them with a single, brutal certainty. The ship was not just trying to scare them. It was not just trying to test them. It was actively, methodically trying to digest them. Chapter 14. The Suture Swarm's Lair. The silence in the utility closet was a thick, heavy shroud. The metallic tang of blood was overpowering. Below them, on the floor, was a horror that their minds refused to fully process. A dark, misshapen pile, the obscene evidence of the rats' feast. Cole was gone. Maya was in shock. She stared at her hand, where the rat bite was welling up with dark blood. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes vacant. The pragmatic, level-headed core of her personality had been shattered. Kellen was not far behind. He felt a strange, cold detachment, a defense mechanism against a reality too monstrous to accept. Cole was dead. They had failed him. They had failed themselves. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice a dead, hollow thing. He wasn't speaking to Maya as much as to himself, forcing words into the void. "We have to move." He slid off the shelf, landing on the clean side of the closet, his back to the gruesome remains. He gently pulled Maya down after him. She was compliant, her body limp, her mind elsewhere. He tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt and clumsily bandaged her bleeding hand. "Maya," he said, his voice soft. "Maya, look at me." She slowly raised her head, her eyes unfocused. "We have to get out," he repeated. "Walter is gone. The power is off. It's just us and the things. There has to be a way off this ship." The mention of escape seemed to spark something in her. A flicker of the old Maya returned. "The lifeboats," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "What?" "The lifeboats," she repeated more strongly. "On the top deck. The emergency davits. The power is out, so the electronic releases won't work, but there should be a manual override, a crank system." It was a plan, a real, tangible goal. It was a lifeline in an ocean of madness. "Okay," Kellen said, nodding. "Okay, lifeboats, top deck." He opened the closet door a crack and peered out. The corridor was empty. The chain dragger was gone. He took a deep breath. "Let's go." They moved like zombies, two survivors in the aftermath of an apocalypse. They found the nearest stairwell and began their ascent, leaving the horrors of the lower decks behind. They climbed past Deck 2, past Deck 3. The ship was utterly silent around them, a dead, steel tomb. They emerged onto Deck 4, the boat deck. It was a wide, open space, though it was still covered by the deck above. Large, hulking shapes loomed in the darkness, the lifeboats still hanging in their davits. There were 4 on each side. "The crank should be near the davit mechanism," Maya said, her voice regaining some of its usual authority. She was channeling her grief into practicality. It was the only way she could cope. They approached the nearest lifeboat. It was a massive, enclosed vessel capable of holding 50 people. The davit that held it was a colossal piece of machinery, a crane-like arm of rusted steel. And at its base, just as Maya had predicted, was a large, spoked wheel like the helm of a small ship. The manual release crank. Kellen grabbed it with both hands. It was stiff, but it moved. With a loud groan of protesting metal, the gears engaged. The davit arm began to tremble. "It's working," he grunted, putting his back into it. "It's actually working." A new sound answered him. A soft, dry, rustling sound. It came from inside the lifeboat. Kellen stopped cranking. He and Maya looked at each other. "There's something in there," he whispered. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by a dry, clicking noise. It was the sound of thousands of tiny, hard objects moving against each other. It was coming from all the lifeboats around them. They had been silent until he started cranking the davit. They had activated them. Maya shone her flashlight beam on the side of the lifeboat. There were small drainage holes along the bottom, and from one of the holes, a single, thin, white thread was emerging. It quested through the air for a moment, like an insect's antenna, before retracting. "The suture swarm," Maya breathed, her voice filled with a new horror. Walter's files had mentioned them, animated spools of surgical thread. A loud tearing sound came from the lifeboat they were standing next to. The canvas cover that shielded its entrance ripped open from the inside. A white torrent poured out, not of water but of thread. Millions upon millions of strands of surgical suture, moving as one. It was not a liquid. It was a solid mass of individual fibers, a flowing river of white that surged onto the deck. The suture swarm. It did not attack them. It began to move with a terrifying architectural purpose. The threads coalesced, weaving themselves together at an impossible speed. They formed thick, cable-like ropes that shot up to the ceiling, anchoring themselves to beams. They wove intricate, complex webs between the davits, blocking the path. In seconds, they had constructed a huge, beautiful, and deadly barrier of white thread around the lifeboats. The threads were pulled taut, gleaming in the flashlight beams. They looked as thin as silk, but as strong as steel wire. Kellen and Maya were trapped in a cocoon of their own making. "It's blocking our escape," Kellen said, stating the obvious. The swarm, its work seemingly done, receded, flowing back into the lifeboats and leaving its shimmering, web-like prison behind. Kellen cautiously approached the nearest strand of the web. He reached out to touch it. "Don't," Maya warned. He ignored her. His finger brushed against the thread. It was unnaturally sharp. A thin, bloodless line appeared on his fingertip. It was a monofilament wire, a razor's edge. The entire web was a gigantic razor blade. "We can't get through this," he said, his hope finally draining away completely. Every escape route was a new trap. Every solution created a more horrifying problem. They were standing in the center of the web, the lifeboats on all sides, the path back to the stairs blocked by the shimmering strands. They were completely, utterly trapped. From the darkest corner of the boat deck, a figure stepped out. It was Walter Hemlock. He was not holding his wrench. His hands were empty. He looked at the web, then at them. There was no madness in his eyes now, only a deep, profound sorrow. "I tried to teach you," he said softly, his voice full of regret. "I tried to show you how to survive, how to listen, how to respect the rules, but you wouldn't learn." "You're a monster," Kellen spat, his voice trembling with rage and despair. "You killed Cole." "I killed no one," Walter corrected, his voice weary. "The ship killed him. He failed his treatment just as you are failing yours." He gestured at the razor web. "This is the final stage, the rejection. The body attacks the foreign agent, the ship is trying to stitch its wounds closed. You are the infection, and this is the scar tissue." He took a step toward them, and for the first time Kellen saw that Walter was not alone. Standing behind him, silent and severe, was Agnes Croft, and beside her, a hulking shadow with spectral chains, and a portly man in a cook's hat. Every major spirit they had encountered was gathered behind him, not as a threatening army but as a silent, grim-faced jury. "There is no escape," Walter said, his voice a final, terrible judgment. "The therapy is over. You have been weighed, you have been measured, and you have been found wanting." The suture swarm began to stir again inside the lifeboats. The rustling sound grew. The web began to vibrate, emitting a low, humming tone. The threads began to contract. The razor web was shrinking. The walls were, quite literally, closing in. Chapter 15. A Place of Rest. The razor web contracted with a low, humming thrum, a sound that resonated in their bones. The shimmering strands, once a stationary barrier, were now a slowly shrinking cage. Inch by inch, the walls of surgical thread drew inward, the geometry of the web tightening, the space they occupied shrinking. "What do we do?" Kellen asked, his voice cracking. He looked at Maya, then at the closing walls of the web. Panic was a physical thing now, a cold knot in his stomach. Maya didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on Walter. He stood outside the web, flanked by his ghostly entourage, a silent observer to their final moments. There was no malice on his face, only a resigned finality. He was a doctor watching a terminal patient flatline. "Walter," Maya shouted, her voice cutting through the humming of the web. "This isn't treatment. This is a death sentence." "Death," Walter replied, his voice calm and even, "is the final treatment for all ailments, the ultimate cure." He raised a hand and pointed at Kellen. "Your sickness was ambition. It led you here. It led your friends to their doom." He then pointed at Maya. "Your sickness was control, your attempts to manage the chaos, to cut the power. You only unleashed a greater chaos. You cannot control a force of nature, and this ship is a force of nature." The web was closer now. They could feel the air pressure changing. They were being compressed. They had minutes, perhaps less, before the razor-sharp threads reached them. Kellen, in a fit of desperate rage, grabbed the heavy pipe wrench he had dropped. "I'll cut my way out," he roared. He swung it at the nearest strand of the web. The metal wrench hit the taut thread. There was a sharp ping sound, like a guitar string snapping. The wrench didn't break the thread. The thread cut the wrench. A deep, clean groove appeared in the solid iron head of the tool. Kellen stared at it in disbelief. The threads were harder than steel. "It's over," Maya whispered, a tear finally tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. The pragmatic shell was gone. The scared, tired woman was all that was left. "He's won." "No," Kellen said, a strange, new idea dawning in his mind. An idea born not of hope, but of pure, spiteful defiance. He looked at the lifeboat nearest to them, the one from which the swarm had first emerged. The manual release crank was still there. "If we're going to die, we're not dying alone." Maya looked at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" "He loves this ship," Kellen said, his eyes wild. "It's his asylum, his kingdom. The ghosts are his family. He wants to heal it." He hefted the damaged wrench. "So let's give him a wound he can never stitch closed." He ran to the davit and grabbed the crank. He began to turn it with all his remaining strength. The davit groaned, the gears screeching in protest. The lifeboat, filled with the seething intelligence of the suture swarm, began to lower. Walter's calm facade finally broke. A look of genuine alarm crossed his face. "What are you doing? Stop. You don't know what you're doing." "I'm performing surgery, Walter," Kellen screamed back, his voice raw. "A radical amputation." The web was shrinking faster, the threads now just feet away. The hum was a deafening roar. Maya screamed as a strand brushed her arm, slicing through her jacket and shirt as if they weren't there. Kellen kept cranking. The lifeboat descended past the edge of the deck. With a final, tremendous groan of stressed metal, the davit arm swung outward, clearing the side of the ship. The lifeboat was now suspended in midair. "Kellen, the web!" Maya shrieked. The razor threads were inches away. Kellen let go of the crank and threw himself to the deck, pulling Maya down with him. They lay flat on the cold steel as the web contracted over them, the threads passing just inches above their bodies. The web continued to shrink until it collapsed in on itself, forming a single, dense, pulsating knot of white fiber in the center of the boat deck, before being reabsorbed by the other lifeboats. They had survived. They were outside the trap. But Kellen wasn't finished. He looked over the edge of the ship. The lifeboat was hanging 20 feet below, directly above the rocky shoal the Mercy was impaled upon. He looked at Walter. The old man was staring at him, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. "She is a place of rest," Walter screamed, his voice filled with anguish. "A place of memory. You cannot harm her." "Watch me," Kellen snarled. He ran back to the David, but he didn't grab the lowering crank. He grabbed the emergency release lever, a thick, rusted bar designed for a catastrophic, immediate drop. It was the one control that was purely mechanical, needing no power. He put his entire weight on it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a scream of shearing bolts and snapping cables, the brake mechanism failed. The lifeboat, with the core of the suture swarm inside it, dropped. It did not hit the water. It plummeted directly onto the jagged, black rocks of the shoal below. The impact was cataclysmic, a sound like a bomb going off. The fiberglass hull shattered, exploding into a million pieces. The swarm, its container destroyed, its collective consciousness shattered, let out a psychic shriek that tore through the air, a wave of pure agony and confusion. But the impact did more than destroy the lifeboat. The force of it, concentrated on the rocks that held the Mercy fast, was the final straw for the ship's broken spine. With a deep, groaning roar that seemed to come from the very soul of the vessel, the ship began to move. The hull plating where it rested on the shoal buckled. The list grew more severe. The Mercy was breaking apart. It was dying. Walter let out a cry of pure, soul-shattering grief, like a father watching his child die. He fell to his knees, his face in his hands. The ghosts behind him began to flicker, their forms destabilizing as the physical structure they were tied to began to fail. Agnes Croft looked down at her own translucent hands as they began to fade. The chain dragger let out a final, confused roar before dissolving into nothing. The ship, their anchor to the world, was letting go. Kellen and Maya stood amidst the chaos, the deck tilting precariously under their feet. The ship was sinking, not slowly as it had been for years, but quickly, imminently. They had won, but their victory was a death sentence. They stared at the churning water below, at the wreckage of the lifeboat being consumed by the waves. There was no escape. They had killed the ship, and now they would die with it. A hand touched Kellen's shoulder. He spun around. It was Walter. His face was streaked with tears, his eyes empty of everything but loss. The mad therapist, the cunning hunter, was gone. All that was left was a sad, broken old man. "She was my home," he whispered. He looked at Kellen, then at Maya. He seemed to see them for the first time not as patients but as people. "There is one last boat, my boat." He pointed toward the stern, to a small, single davit launch, a tiny dinghy he must have used for supplies. It was their only chance. The deck gave a violent lurch. A huge section of the superstructure collapsed with a deafening crash, sending sparks and debris into the air. "Go," Walter said, his voice flat. He gave them a small, gentle push. "Go now. Someone should live to tell her story, to remember her." He turned his back on them and walked toward the bow of the dying ship, toward the place where the damage was worst. He walked to the edge and stood there, a captain choosing to go down with his vessel, waiting to be reunited with his lost family in the cold, dark water. Kellen and Maya looked at each other. Without a word, they turned and ran, scrambling across the tilting, groaning deck toward their last, desperate chance for survival, leaving the last patient to his final rest. Chapter 16. The Keel's Lament. The run toward the stern was a desperate, stumbling flight across a dying animal's back. The ship groaned around them, a chorus of tearing steel and shuddering bulkheads. The deck, now tilted at a severe 15-degree angle, had transformed from a flat surface into a treacherous slope slick with sea spray, and some viscous fluid leaking from a ruptured pipe. "This way," Maya yelled, pointing toward the starboard side. The port walkway was already beginning to dip toward the churning water. They scrambled, using railings and bolted-down equipment as handholds. A series of sharp, explosive reports echoed from deep within the ship as boilers or fuel tanks gave way. A plume of black smoke billowed from a mid-deck vent, momentarily obscuring the gray, unforgiving sky. Kellen's mind was a maelstrom of conflicting thoughts. He had done this. His final, defiant act had murdered the vessel. It was a moment of supreme, terrible power, and the recoil was a nauseating wave of guilt. He had saved them from the web only to doom them to the ocean. Now, their survival depended on the words of the very man whose world he had just destroyed. "The David should be just past that superstructure," Maya shouted, her voice thin against the rising crescendo of the ship's death agony. They rounded a block of rusted machinery and saw it. The small launch Walter had spoken of. It was an old, rigid-hulled inflatable boat, maybe 15 feet long, lashed securely to a small, single-armed davit. It was their ark. But their hope was immediately crushed. The massive lurch that had followed the lifeboat's destruction had taken its toll. A huge ventilation unit, torn from its roof mountings, had crashed down onto the deck, its twisted metal bulk blocking direct access to the davit's release mechanism. A space of only 2 feet remained between the wreckage and the deck's railing, a narrow, precarious ledge over a 50-foot drop to the violent sea. "We can't get to it," Kellen said, the words feeling like stones in his throat. "Yes, we can," Maya insisted, her eyes scanning the wreckage with a familiar, analytical glint. The pragmatist was re-emerging from the shell of the victim. "The manual release is on the far side. That ledge. I can fit through there. I can get to the crank." "Maya, no," Kellen said, grabbing her arm. "That's suicide. One slip and you're gone." "And if we stay here, we're both gone," she countered, pulling her arm free. "You got us into this, Kellen. Let me get us out." Her words were not accusatory, just a statement of fact. His defiance had created this problem. Her caution would solve it. It was the last, desperate synthesis of their personalities. She didn't wait for his permission. She moved to the wreckage and turned sideways, pressing her back against the cold, sharp metal of the ventilation unit. She began to inch her way across the narrow ledge, her feet shuffling, her hands seeking purchase on the twisted steel. Kellen watched, his heart pounding in his chest. The ship gave another violent shudder and the deck lurched again. Maya cried out as her foot slipped, her body lurching toward the open air. For a terrifying second, she dangled over the abyss, her grip on a shard of metal, the only thing keeping her from falling. Kellen rushed forward, helplessness a bitter taste in his mouth. He couldn't reach her. He couldn't help her. With a grunt of pure, animal effort, Maya swung her leg back and found a foothold. She pressed herself against the wreckage, her chest heaving. She did not look back. She just continued to shuffle, inch by painstaking inch, across the ledge of death. Finally, she was across. She was standing on the small, clear patch of deck next to the davit mechanism. She looked back at Kellen, her face pale but her eyes blazing with fierce determination. She grabbed the manual release crank. It was smaller than the ones for the main lifeboats, but just as rusted. She put her entire body into it, her feet braced against the tilting deck. The gears shrieked. The davit arm, holding the small boat, began to swing outward, moving the launch from its position over the deck to over the water. "It's working," she yelled. The ship answered with a final, terrible roar. It was not the sound of tearing metal, but of collapsing foundations. The bow, which had been impaled on the shoal, broke free. The entire front third of the USNS Mercy tore away from the main body, plunging into the sea with a monstrous splash that sent a wave surging up the side of the hull. The rest of the ship, now free of its anchor, began to roll. The deck tilted violently, going from 15 degrees to 30 in a matter of seconds. Kellen lost his footing, sliding across the slick deck and slamming into the wreckage of the ventilation unit. Maya screamed as she was thrown against the davit, the crank torn from her hands. The small boat, now hanging free over the water, swung wildly on its cables. "The rope ladder," Maya shrieked, pointing. A canvas ladder was coiled near the base of the davit, designed for climbing into the boat once it was in the water. "Throw it to me." Kellen, bruised and battered, crawled to the ladder. It was heavy, but he managed to uncoil it and, with a desperate heave, toss one end across the wreckage to Maya. She caught it, her fingers wrapping around the coarse rope. "Secure it," she yelled, "then come across." Kellen looped his end around a solid steel cleat, pulling it taut. The ladder was now a makeshift lifeline spanning the wreckage. Maya tied her end to the base of the davit. It was their only way to the boat. "Hold on," Kellen shouted. He launched himself onto the rope ladder, his hands and feet finding the rungs. It swung wildly under his weight, the chasm of churning water and sharp rocks yawning below him. He began to pull himself across, hand over hand, his muscles screaming in protest. He was halfway across when a shadow fell over him. He looked up. Walter Hemlock stood on top of the ventilation wreckage, looking down at him. He had not gone to the bow. He had followed them. "It's not over," Walter said, his voice quiet amidst the chaos. "You have made her scream. Now you must listen to her last words." He was not threatening Kellen. He was trying to tell him something. "She won't let you leave," Walter continued, his eyes full of a strange, urgent clarity. "Her heart is broken. Its pain will create a whirlpool. It will pull you down with her. You must euthanize it." Before Kellen could ask what he meant, the deck gave a final, convulsive lurch. Walter lost his balance. He did not cry out. He simply accepted it. He toppled from the wreckage and fell into the darkness, vanishing into the ship's churning, watery grave. His last warning hung in the air, a final, cryptic piece of his insane therapy. Kellen reached the other side, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He and Maya stood by the David, the small boat swinging just out of reach. Below them, the ship was sinking fast, the sea climbing the hull like a hungry beast. Walter's final, puzzling words echoed in his mind. You must euthanize her heart. Chapter 17. The Chamber of the Heart. What did he mean? Maya asked, her eyes wide as she stared at the spot where Walter had vanished. What heart? I don't know and I don't care, Kellen said, his voice ragged. He was done with riddles. We're leaving. But Walter's prophecy was already coming true. As the ship sank, the water around it was not just churning, it was beginning to swirl. A vortex was forming, a nascent whirlpool with the dying vessel at its epicenter. The small inflatable boat, their ark, was being pulled toward the hull, threatening to be smashed against the steel. He was right, Maya breathed, her face pale with a new kind of horror. It's pulling us in. We'll never get clear. Kellen looked from the swirling water to the dark, gaping wounds in the ship's superstructure. They had to go back into the sinking vessel to chase a madman's final ghost. It was an insane choice, but staying was certain death. The bilge, Kellen said, the word tasting like ash. The lowest point of the ship. If it has a heart, it would be there. Kellen, we can't, Maya pleaded. It's suicide. It's a chance, he countered, his eyes hard. It's the only one we have. He looked at the swinging boat, then at the nearest gaping hole in the ship's side, a cargo hatch torn from its hinges. It was a black mouth leading back into the nightmare. I'm going. You can stay here. He didn't wait for her answer. He scrambled through the hatch, back into the tilting, groaning corridors of the Mercy. After a moment's hesitation, Maya followed. To die together in the dark was better than to die alone in the light. They were in a labyrinth of service corridors, a world turned on its side. Water was pouring in everywhere, cascading down stairwells and gushing from ruptured pipes. They were not walking, they were climbing, using pipes and conduits as handholds to navigate the slanting decks. They were descending into the guts of the ship, moving against the flow of the rising water. The pressure increased with every deck they descended. The groans of the ship were louder here, the shrieks of tortured metal a constant assault. They found a maintenance ladder and climbed down into the engine room. The massive diesel engines were silent, half submerged in murky, oil-slicked water. The silence was more terrifying than their previous humming. The bilge access should be through here, Kellen shouted over the roar of cascading water. They found it, a small, circular hatch in the floor with a wheel for a handle. Water was jetting from its seams. This was the lowest point. Together they turned the wheel. It was incredibly stiff, but the rising water pressure on the other side helped. With a final, groaning pop, the hatch blew open and a geyser of foul, black water erupted, knocking them off their feet. The bilge was flooded, but the torrent subsided, the water levels equalizing with the engine room. What was left was an opening into a cavern of absolute blackness, from which a new sound emerged. It was a low, rhythmic pulsing, a slow, deep, resonant beat like a monstrous, submerged heart, and with it came a wave of pure, concentrated emotion. Not rage or fear, but a bottomless, soul-crushing despair. "The heart," Maya whispered, her face ashen. They lowered themselves into the black, chest-deep water. It was freezing cold and thick with filth. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing the ship's true belly, a space of massive, curving ribs of steel, like the inside of a metal whale. And in the center of the space, they saw it. It was not a creature of flesh and bone. It was a colossal, amorphous mass of dark, pulsating energy anchored to the very keel of the ship. It looked like a tumor made of shadow and light. Within its swirling, semi-translucent form, they could see things suspended. Fragments of rusted metal, scraps of uniform, rotted wood, and the faint, ghostly outlines of human faces, their mouths open in silent screams. It was the amalgam, the gangrenous bloom, and every other horror on the ship, all boiled down to their primary source. It was the psychic sludge of 50 years of death and misery, given a single, unified, beating heart. As they watched, it pulsed, and with each beat the whirlpool on the surface intensified. It was the source. The entity seemed to sense them. The pulses quickened. The wave of despair it radiated grew stronger. Maya cried out, clutching her head as a vision flooded her mind. Cole's face, his eyes wide with terror as the rats swarmed him, his last scream echoing in her soul. Kellen felt it too. He saw his father's last, gasping breaths in the hospital, but this time the face was his own. He was drowning in failure, in the irrelevance Walter had diagnosed. The heart was not attacking them physically. It was showing them their own personal hells, feeding on their despair. It was the ultimate therapeutic tool, and its only function was to make them give up. "Fight it," Kellen yelled, though his own will was crumbling. "How?" Maya sobbed, sinking to her knees in the foul water. "How do you fight this?" Kellen looked at the pulsating mass. Violence wouldn't work. They had nothing that could harm it. Walter's words came back to him. "You must euthanize it." How do you euthanize a feeling? He thought of the cook's illusion broken by reality. He thought of the matron placated by order. He thought of Dr. Stern repelled by a modern chemical. Each entity had a rule, a weakness based on its purpose. What was the purpose of this thing? It was a heart of pure pain. It existed to feel misery. What was the opposite of that? Peace, acceptance. It was a terrifying, insane leap of logic. He looked at Maya, drowning in her own grief. He looked at the pulsating heart, feeding on it. He took a deep breath, the foul bilge water sloshing around his ribs. He let go. He stopped fighting the vision of his own failure. He accepted it. He let the despair wash over him, but instead of struggling, he simply let it be. He acknowledged the fear, the guilt, the emptiness, and he forgave himself. The effect was instantaneous. The vision in his head flickered and died. The psychic pressure receded. The heart seemed to pulse with confusion. He had given it pain, and it had expected him to scream. His acceptance was a flavor it did not understand, a nutrient it could not process. It was like feeding poison to a predator. "Maya," he said, his voice calm and clear. "Let go, stop fighting it, accept it. It's the only way." Maya looked at him, her face a mask of torment. The vision of Cole's death was replaying over and over in her mind. "I can't. I left him." "You couldn't save him," Kellen said gently. "It's over, it's done, let it go." Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the filthy water. She took a shuddering breath and closed her eyes. She stopped fighting the memory. She let it play, she accepted her failure, her fear, her part in it all. And slowly, the psychic assault on her mind began to fade. The heart of the Mercy pulsed erratically now, like a real heart in fibrillation. It was being starved, poisoned by their peace. It began to shrink, its dark energy contracting, its captured souls flickering. It gave one last, desperate pulse. A wave of pure, physical force erupted from it, throwing Kellen and Maya against the steel ribs of the ship. The water in the bilge churned violently. And then, with a soft, final sigh that seemed to echo through the entire vessel, the heart dissolved. It did not explode. It simply unraveled, its dark energy dissipating into nothing, leaving only the cold, filthy water of the bilge. The rhythmic pulsing was gone. The psychic pressure vanished. A strange, profound peace settled over the lowest deck of the ship. On the surface, the whirlpool faltered, its energy source gone. The swirling water began to calm. They had done it. They had euthanized the ship's heart. Chapter 18: The Last Breath. The moment the heart dissolved, the ship gave a final, deep shudder. It was not a lurch of destruction, but a sigh of release. The groaning of stressed metal softened, the tearing sound ceased. The vessel, its soul finally at peace, was now just a shell of steel, surrendering to the sea. But it was sinking faster. The water in the bilge rose with alarming speed, climbing from their chests to their necks in seconds. "We have to go," Kellen yelled, the strange calm of the last few moments shattered by the immediate physical threat. "Now." They clawed their way out of the bilge, back into the half-submerged engine room. The ascent was a frantic, desperate struggle against the rising water. Stairwells had become waterfalls. Corridors were canals. They were swimming more than climbing, pulling themselves through the wrecked interior of the ship. The light changed. They were nearing the surface. They scrambled out of the same cargo hatch they had entered, emerging onto the tilting deck. The sky was brighter, the gray of the storm giving way to the pale, watery light of dawn. The Mercy was almost gone. Only the stern section and the tall superstructure of the bridge remained above the waves. The rest was submerged. Their boat, the small inflatable, was still there, bobbing on the now calm water a few dozen yards away, its rope ladder still tied to the davit. It was their last and only hope. "We have to jump for it," Maya said, her eyes on the boat. The deck gave a final, slow lurch as the stern began its final plunge. They didn't have time. Kellen looked at the rope ladder, still secured to the davit and the cleat. It was their only connection to the boat. He ran to the davit, untied the knot, and began to pull, hauling the boat closer to the sinking ship. "What are you doing?" Maya cried. "It'll be pulled down with us." "It won't if we're fast enough," he yelled back. He pulled until the boat was scraping against the side of the hull, directly below them. The deck was now angled at a terrifying 45 degrees. They were clinging to the high side, the water just feet below. "Jump," Kellen commanded. Maya jumped, a leap of faith into the small, bobbing vessel. She landed hard, nearly capsizing it. Kellen followed a second later, untying the ladder from the cleat on the sinking deck as he fell. He landed in a heap next to Maya. They were in the boat. They were free of the ship. But the ladder was still attached to the boat. Its other end, now untied, was sinking with the Mercy, acting as a sea anchor dragging them down. "The knife!" Maya screamed, fumbling in her pockets. She had a small utility knife she used for her equipment. Her hands were numb with cold and she dropped it. Kellen saw it. He dove for the side of the inflatable, plunging his arm into the freezing water to grab the sinking ladder. He found a rung and began to pull it in, hand over hand, trying to get it aboard before its weight pulled them under. The stern of the USNS Mercy rose into the air for its final bow. The great rudder and propellers were exposed for a moment, water streaming from them. It hung there for a silent, majestic second against the dawn sky. Then, with a sound like a great, final exhalation, it slipped beneath the waves. The sinking ladder pulled taut, yanking the side of their small boat down, threatening to flip it. Water poured in. Kellen gave one last, desperate heave. The end of the ladder, the heavy metal hook from the davit, was pulled clear of the water. The drag vanished. The inflatable righted itself, sitting low in the water, swamped but afloat. They had made it. They collapsed in the bottom of the boat, gasping, shivering, surrounded by a few inches of cold sea water. The ocean around them was calm, littered with small pieces of debris. Where the great hospital ship had been, there was now only a patch of disturbed, bubbling water. She was gone. They drifted in silence for what felt like an eternity. The sun broke through the clouds, its weak light painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The warmth felt alien, a memory from another lifetime. Kellen sat up. He looked at Maya. Her face was a mess of grime, salt, and dried blood. Her eyes were hollow, haunted. She looked at him, and he knew his own face reflected the same horrors. They were survivors, but they were not victors. The cost of their survival was etched into their souls. They would forever be the last patients of the USNS Mercy. He scanned the horizon, and he saw it. A tiny speck of light flashing with a steady, rhythmic pulse. It was not a ghost. It was not a trick. It was a navigation beacon. A boat. Help. He did not cheer. He did not cry out. He simply watched it, a silent, broken man in a broken boat. Maya saw it too. She reached out, her cold, trembling fingers finding his. Her grip was weak, but it was there. A shared, silent acknowledgement of the abyss they had crawled out of. They were alive. And for now, in the quiet dawn on a calm sea, that would have to be enough. The end.